Hello, dear friends. Welcome back to Sleepy Whisper. Before we begin, I invite you to set your volume just low enough to be gentle on your ears. Find a comfortable position, close your eyes, and allow yourself to rest in silence. Together, we will drift slowly into sleep. Tonight, we start with the first story in our series of boring history for sleep, the towns left behind by the changing river. If you enjoy this calm journey, please remember to like this video and subscribe, so that you can return here every night. Now, let us begin. For centuries, rivers have been the lifeblood of towns, carrying not only water but also trade, stories, and the slow rhythm of human settlement. Along their banks, entire communities once flourished, depending on the steady flow to irrigate fields, to power mills, and to connect one town with the next through small boats and barges. But rivers are not as fixed as they may seem. They bend, shift, dry, flood, and sometimes abandon the very towns that once trusted them for survival. Tonight we begin a long, quiet reflection on such towns, left behind by the changing river. Imagine a settlement that first emerged when a group of farmers decided the bend of a river offered both fertile soil and a natural harbor. Wooden houses stood close to the bank, and slowly the community expanded with a mill turning steadily in the current, and a market square where goods were exchanged. The rhythm of daily life was measured by the river. When it rose, there was concern for flooding. When it fell, there was hope for planting. People timed their festivals to the river's seasonal moods, knowing that as long as the waters continued to flow, the town would remain secure. Yet rivers, though powerful, follow only the laws of nature and not the wishes of those who build along them. Over decades, sediment builds, currents carve new channels, and floods alter the course in ways that appear slow to a single generation but become dramatic when viewed across centuries. One can imagine a town waking to discover that the main channel of the river had shifted several hundred feet away. Boats that once tied directly at the dock now had to be dragged across mudflats. Merchants complained of lost customers, and farmers worried their irrigation channels were left dry. Slowly, life grew less certain. What is striking is how gradual the change often was. At first, only a few complained. Perhaps an elder mentioned that the water seemed lower than in his youth. Perhaps a fisherman noted that the current had weakened where he used to cast his nets. Most ignored such remarks. After all, the river was still there, still moving, still seemingly eternal. But within a few decades, the entire landscape transformed. Markets dwindled, houses were abandoned, and a new generation grew up never knowing the once vibrant connection between town and river. Across Europe, Asia, and the Americas, such stories repeated. The Loire in France shifted its flow, leaving once prosperous trading points stranded inland. In China, smaller branches of the Yellow River often deserted the villages built upon them, while new channels cut across fields miles away. In America, towns along the Mississippi found themselves bypassed when the river, impatient with bends, created shortcuts and left old stretches to stagnate as oxbow lakes. Imagine the silence of those lakes, where once paddle steamers and rafts carried voices and commerce. The towns remained, but without the energy of moving water, they became quiet places, visited only by those passing through. The people who lived there adapted as best they could. Some turned to roads when they replaced riverboats as the main arteries of trade. Others clung stubbornly to fading wharfs, hoping that floods might one day restore the channel. But nature rarely reversed itself so neatly. What had been lost to erosion or deposited in new banks was not easily undone. The river had spoken in its slow language of sediment and current, and the town was left behind. There is something deeply reflective in these stories. They remind us that permanence is an illusion. What feels like the solid heart of daily life may, in truth, be temporary, shaped by forces larger and quieter than we notice. To those who lived in the towns, the decline was not dramatic like a war or fire. It was subtle, spread over lifetimes, until one day the market square that once echoed with trade stood silent, and the river could only be glimpsed from afar. Tonight, as you drift into rest, picture these quiet places. Picture the wooden docks now covered in reeds, the warehouses crumbling, the mill wheel still standing though the current no longer turns it. Imagine the evening air, heavy with the memory of water that has gone elsewhere, leaving the town to continue in slower rhythms. This is not tragedy, but simply history unfolding in its patient way, teaching us about change, about resilience, and about how communities rise and fade with the landscapes that shape them. As centuries continued, the quiet retreat of rivers left behind layers, not only of silt, but also of memory. To walk through such towns long after the water had shifted was to sense the echo of lives once deeply bound to the current. Streets that once bustled with carts hauling grain to river docks now led only to patches of grass where children played unaware that their grandparents had known the place as the center of trade. The silence was not immediate. It crept in slowly, in the way weeds appear first between stones and then take hold across entire courtyards. For many families, the first sign of change was economic rather than visual. A merchant who once relied on travelers arriving by boat began to notice fewer customers. At first, he blamed the harvest or the weather, never suspecting that the cause was the slow diversion of water away from town. Years later, when his son inherited the shop, the decline became undeniable. Shelves that once carried spices and cloth from faraway ports were left half empty, while local goods piled up unsold. A miller discovered that the channel driving his wheel no longer carried enough current to grind flour with the same force. He patched the structure, raised the sluices, even dug trenches to redirect water, but each effort lasted only a season before the river shifted further away. For him, the decline was not abstract. It was the sound of the wheel slowing, the grinding stones turning sluggishly, the work that once required 3 strong men now reduced to waiting idly as the flow diminished. Yet life carried on because people adjusted in small ways. Farmers built deeper wells, children walked longer paths to fetch water, and churches held prayers for rain or for the river's return. These responses were human attempts to bargain with nature, yet the river answered only with silence and the steady redirection of its course. Travelers passing through noticed the changes even more clearly. A boatman who once stopped weekly now found the town inaccessible, his vessel stranded on sandbars. He chose instead to dock at another settlement where the current still flowed strong. Over time, maps themselves adjusted, no longer marking the old harbor as a major stop, but as a minor point easily overlooked. Imagine a traveler many years later arriving by road. He would find inns with faded signs, once proud but now barely maintained, their owners still telling stories of when the river bustled with life. The traveler might not understand why the wide street leading to the river ended in a marsh, or why the warehouses stood empty with doors swinging in the wind. But to the older residents, each abandoned building was a reminder of what had been. The rhythm of community life changed as well. Festivals once tied to the river's abundance grew quieter. Boat races that had marked the start of summer became impossible without the current to carry vessels. Instead, the townsfolk held gatherings on dry ground, trying to preserve tradition in altered form. Music still played, but without the river sparkling beside them, the joy carried a faint melancholy. One might think that such towns vanished entirely, but many endured, simply in diminished form. Some reinvented themselves as farming villages, their people turning away from trade and focusing on local harvests. Others waited hopefully for centuries, telling children that perhaps one day the river would return. In some rare cases, floods did briefly restore water to old channels, filling residents with renewed optimism. Yet more often the floods carved even newer paths, leaving the town further behind. The persistence of these communities is a quiet testament to human resilience. Even when the very foundation of their economy disappeared, they continued, stubbornly rooted to the soil where their ancestors had built homes. And so, walking through these places today, one sees not ruins in the dramatic sense, but a gentler kind of fading. Houses stand, but with fewer families. Schools remain, but with fewer children. And churches still ring bells, though fewer congregants gather. The towns are not gone. They are simply quieter, living in the shadow of the river that once defined them. As you rest tonight, imagine standing on the edge of such a town at dusk. The air is still, the sky turning to soft gray, and in the distance the old river glimmers faintly, too far to reach, but close enough to remind everyone of its absence. The silence feels almost like a companion, steady and unchanging, whispering that history moves on, even when we wish it would pause. This is the story of how rivers shape not only landscapes, but also destinies, leaving behind places where memory flows stronger than water. When we think of the river leaving a town, it is tempting to imagine an abrupt moment, a single day when the water vanished and the town was left desolate. But the truth is more subtle and perhaps more haunting. The river's retreat was not an event but a process, a slow unweaving of ties that bound water and community together. Families might live their entire lives without realizing that they were witnessing the decline of their settlement, for the changes were too gradual to grasp until a generation later when the difference became undeniable. Consider the story of a bridge, built with pride when the river ran deep beneath it. In its first decades, boats passed under daily, their sails brushing the underside of the arch at high water. Children leaned over the railing to wave at crews and toss flowers that drifted downstream. Yet as silt collected and the current shifted, the water grew shallower. Decades later, grass sprouted where the river once ran, and eventually the bridge stood like a monument over dry ground, admired for its construction but no longer serving its original purpose. For the townspeople, the bridge became both a symbol of pride and a reminder of loss. Such relics dotted many landscapes, from the stone piers of Europe to the wooden trestles of Asia and the simple ferries abandoned in America. Each structure carried with it the memory of movement, of goods exchanged, of neighbors connected by water. When the river shifted, these markers remained in place, slowly weathering under sun and rain, bearing silent witness to a time when life revolved around the flowing current. What is striking is how communities sought to adapt through ingenuity. In some towns, canals were dug in hopes of reconnecting to the main course of the river. These canals often worked for a time, reviving trade and allowing boats once again to reach the town. But canals require maintenance, and without steady flow, they clogged with silt or dried in summer heat. Eventually, efforts to resist the river's decision proved too costly or futile, and the towns returned to their slower pace. In other places, markets shifted from river trade to land trade. Roads replaced waterways, and inns sprang up along dusty routes where merchants now traveled with carts instead of boats. The town did not vanish. It simply changed character, becoming less cosmopolitan and more provincial. Some residents welcomed the quiet, enjoying a life less hurried, though many lamented the loss of opportunity and connection. The psychological effect of the river's departure was perhaps as profound as the economic one. For generations, people had identified themselves as river folk. Their songs, their festivals, even their daily language carried references to the water. To live by the river was to feel part of something larger, a natural force that connected distant regions. When the river moved, this identity slowly dissolved. Elders told stories of when the water lapped at their doorsteps, but to younger generations, those tales sounded almost mythical. The bond between people and river became a memory rather than a living reality. Still, not all was sorrow. The abandoned riverbeds often became fertile ground. Where boats once docked, farmers now planted vegetables. What had been a bustling port could, over time, turn into lush meadows filled with wildflowers. Nature reclaimed what commerce had left behind, and in this transformation there was a certain beauty. Travelers described towns surrounded by quiet fields, with the ghost of the old river winding through as a line of greener grass or a string of small ponds. Some of these ponds became habitats for birds and fish, bringing a new kind of life to the area. Thus, the departure of the river was not purely an ending, but a transformation, a reminder that landscapes shift and humans must shift with them. As you imagine these scenes, picture walking along the remains of an old riverbank at twilight. The stones of the dock are still there, though half covered by moss. The air smells of earth rather than water. Insects hum softly, and in the distance, the faint glimmer of the new river course can be seen reflecting the moon. It is peaceful, quiet, and strangely timeless. The town lives on, though changed, carrying with it the lesson that permanence is never promised. In the slow retreat of rivers, we see the passage of history itself, steady, patient, indifferent, yet strangely poetic, leaving behind towns that become chapters in a much larger story of change. In many regions, the story of a town and its river was not merely local, but part of a greater web of history. For rivers have always been highways of civilization, linking inland fields to distant seas. When a river abandoned a town, it did more than reduce commerce. It rearranged entire trade routes. A merchant carrying salt or grain would no longer stop at the quiet port, but instead follow the new bends that favored other settlements. Thus, fortunes shifted across the map, not because of kings or wars, but because of water flowing a little differently year by year. Imagine a network of towns along a great river, each depending on the others for goods and news. When one was left behind, the others scarcely paused, for trade is always drawn to movement. The forgotten town lingered like a faded link in a chain, remembered only when travelers told of its decline. Yet for those who lived there, the story was personal, a gradual realization that their place in the world had changed. Archaeologists uncover traces of this history in layers of earth. In some towns, they find docks far from any present water, their stones worn smooth by centuries of loading and unloading. They discover pottery shards that once held goods transported by boat, lying now in soil untouched by water for generations. These findings remind us that what seems fixed in our own time is in truth fragile. Rivers that appear steady are, beneath the surface, restless and shifting. To live by a river is to trust in a neighbor who may one day depart without farewell. Consider also the role of memory. Families carried stories of the river long after it left. A grandmother might describe the way lanterns reflected on the water during midsummer festivals, though her grandchildren saw only fields where cows grazed. A father might speak of fishing trips in his youth, while his children knew only dry reeds. In this way, the river lived on as an inheritance of memory, a presence more in words than in water. Sometimes this memory created longing. Towns petitioned rulers or engineers to bring the river back through canals or diversions, but the projects often failed or served only a short time. The cost was too great, the silt too persistent, the current too stubborn. Nature reminded humans that control is fleeting. Other times, memory created pride. Even when trade had gone elsewhere, residents still spoke of their heritage as river folk. They held on to songs, recipes, and festivals that recalled their watery past. Visitors might be surprised to find a town without a river celebrating a boat parade. Yet for the townspeople, it was a way of honoring continuity, even in the face of change. There were also spiritual dimensions. In some cultures, rivers were seen as living beings, divine presences that gave life or took it away. When the river moved, priests and elders interpreted it as a message. Some believed the town had angered the spirits. Others saw it as a sign to seek new lands. Thus, the retreat of a river was never merely physical. It carried layers of meaning that touched economy, identity, and belief. What is most striking is the patience with which people adapted. There was rarely rebellion against the river's will. Instead, there was endurance, a quiet acceptance that life must continue differently. Fields were expanded, roads improved, wells dug deeper. The town shifted its focus from water to soil, from movement to stability. In this adjustment lay a kind of wisdom, an understanding that permanence is an illusion and that survival requires adaptation. As you let your eyes grow heavy tonight, imagine standing in the middle of one such town. Around you are houses of stone and wood, weathered but sturdy. The streets are empty, save for a cat slipping into an alley. The air carries no scent of river water, yet the silence is filled with the memory of it. You walk toward the old dock, now a meadow dotted with flowers. The stones beneath your feet still remember the weight of barrels and crates, though they now support only the quiet passage of time. In the distance, the new river flows, out of sight but not out of mind, a reminder that change is constant. The town remains, the people endure, and the story continues, shaped always by the unseen currents of history. As centuries moved forward and rivers continued their silent reshaping of the land, the towns left behind became places where history seemed to linger more heavily than elsewhere. Travelers described them as quiet yet dignified, with wide streets that no longer echoed with the noise of carts and animals, but instead with the gentle sound of footsteps and the wind through empty arches. It was not uncommon for visitors to remark on the peculiar beauty of such places, where grand buildings stood half-deserted, their facades speaking of prosperity long vanished, and where the outlines of old harbors could still be traced in the ground, though no boat had docked there in living memory. The people who remained were often resilient, bound more by attachment to their ancestral soil than by the promise of wealth. To them, the town was more than its river. It was the place of their stories, their cemeteries, their churches, and their fields. And so life carried on, smaller, quieter, but still marked by the dignity of endurance. In some towns, the loss of the river led to curious adaptations. a former warehouse that once stored grain from distant ports might be converted into a barn for local livestock. A grand marketplace built for merchants carrying spices and fabrics might serve now as the venue for local fairs, where children played and neighbors exchanged small goods. The structures endured even as their functions shifted, just as the people endured even as their fortunes changed. This quiet continuity gave such towns a character unlike any bustling city. They became places where time seemed slower, where the rhythm of life was measured not by trade or ships, but by the cycles of planting, harvesting, and memory. Yet the traces of the river were never far. Old maps still depicted the town as a port, though the river had long abandoned it. Songs still told of fishing boats, though no nets had been cast there for generations. Festivals continued to feature symbolic references to water, even if children had never seen a vessel on their doorstep. The presence of the river lingered like an echo, reminding everyone that history is not erased, but layered, with old chapters still visible beneath the new. Some towns, left behind by rivers, became centers of reflection rather than commerce. Monasteries and schools found quiet ground there, building upon the slower pace of life to cultivate learning or devotion. Without the distractions of trade and travel, such places became known for scholarship, for music, for contemplation. In this way, what was lost in economic power was sometimes balanced by gains in cultural depth. A visitor centuries later might describe a town no longer marked on major trade maps, yet producing manuscripts of great beauty, or music that traveled far beyond the silent riverbed. Nature, too, found its own use for these abandoned channels. Birds nested in the reeds, fish filled the ponds left behind, and animals roamed where docks once stood. To walk there at dawn was to see herons lifting into the sky, their wings reflecting the first light. What had been a human hub returned gradually to a landscape of quiet creatures, a reminder that rivers and towns are only temporary arrangements in a world where nature always claims the final word. For the people, this transformation was bittersweet. They gained meadows and farmland, but they lost the sense of connection that flowing water once brought. To live by a river was to be part of a chain of communities stretching across great distances. To live without it was to feel more isolated, more bound to the soil underfoot, and less to the wider world. And yet this too brought a certain peace. Without the river's traffic, there were fewer conflicts, fewer disputes over tolls and harbors. The town became self-sufficient, quiet, content in its smaller sphere. As you let your mind wander tonight, imagine standing in such a place at sunset. The buildings glow faintly in the fading light, their stones holding centuries of warmth. The fields stretch gently beyond, dotted with animals grazing in calm rhythm. And where once the river roared, there is now only a line of grass and reeds, whispering softly in the evening breeze. You feel the weight of time, but also its gentleness, the way history does not vanish but settles like silt, creating new ground on which future generations walk. These towns remind us that change is not always catastrophe. Sometimes it is simply the slow turning of the page, leaving behind spaces of quiet reflection where once there was noise and movement. As centuries unfolded, the pattern of rivers shifting and towns adjusting repeated itself in countless regions, forming a quiet rhythm of history that is easy to overlook yet deeply influential. When we think of great events, we often imagine wars, inventions, or the rise and fall of kings, but the steady migration of a river channel could shape the destiny of entire communities just as profoundly. In some places, the departure of the river created a sense of abandonment, as if the heart of the town had been carried away. In others, it simply changed the focus of life, turning bustling ports into pastoral villages, redirecting energy from commerce to farming, from movement to stillness. What is striking is how little resistance people offered to this transformation. Unlike invasions or disasters, there was no enemy to fight, no sudden calamity to rebuild from. The river's departure was too gradual, too natural, and so it was met with quiet acceptance. In time, this acceptance grew into identity. A child born a generation after the river left did not see herself as deprived, but as part of a town known for its fields or its schools rather than for its boats. Over the course of centuries, what had once been remembered with longing became instead a distant legend, a story told in hushed tones by elders who spoke of a river that once flowed at the town's feet. Archaeologists and historians who study these places describe them with a certain melancholy, yet also with fascination. They find remnants of docks where no water has touched for hundreds of years, shards of pottery bearing the marks of distant lands, coins from merchants who once tied their vessels at the harbor. These artifacts whisper of connections long gone, showing how a town once thrived within a larger world. Yet what is equally fascinating is what replaced them. Traces of farming tools, wells dug deeper, barns built over old market squares. In these layers, one sees adaptation, the slow redirection of human life to meet new realities. Nature too left marks of its own. Oxbow lakes formed where the river had once meandered, leaving behind crescent-shaped waters that sparkled quietly under the sun. These lakes became sanctuaries for birds and fish, inviting life where commerce had once dominated. Travelers centuries later described them as beautiful, serene, places where one could sense both the presence and absence of the river. To walk along their edges was to feel the passage of time itself, for every curve of the land told the story of a current that had carved, retreated, and left behind silence. What may surprise us is how many such towns still exist today. Across Europe, Asia, Africa, and the Americas, one can find communities whose streets seem too wide for their present population, whose churches seem too grand for their quiet congregations. These traces are the echoes of a time when the river granted them wealth and importance. To visit them now is to step into a landscape of memory, where every stone, every empty warehouse, every meadow was once alive with waterborne life. The persistence of these towns shows the human tendency not to abandon lightly, but to remain rooted even when circumstances shift. Families stayed because their ancestors were buried there, because the soil was familiar, because the houses built by great-grandparents still stood. This deep connection to place reveals something about human endurance. We do not thrive only where prosperity flows. We also endure where history settles. And so, when we reflect on these towns left behind by changing rivers, we are reminded that history is not only about progress or decline, but about transformation. The river continues to flow elsewhere, and new towns rise on its banks, but the old ones remain, quieter, gentler, layered with stories. As you drift toward sleep, imagine yourself walking through such a town at dawn. The streets are still, the sky just beginning to lighten, and in the distance the faint line of the old river is visible as a band of darker green across the land. The silence feels almost sacred, as if the town itself is whispering its story, not with drama, but with patience. In this quiet, you understand that time does not erase, but reshapes, and that even places left behind carry meaning, dignity, and peace. As centuries unfolded, the pattern of rivers shifting and towns adjusting repeated itself in countless regions, forming a quiet rhythm of history that is easy to overlook yet deeply influential. When we think of great events, we often imagine wars, inventions, or the rise and fall of kings, but the steady migration of a river channel could shape the destiny of entire communities just as profoundly. In some places, the departure of the river created a sense of abandonment, as if the heart of the town had been carried away. In others, it simply changed the focus of life, turning bustling ports into pastoral villages, redirecting energy from commerce to farming, from movement to stillness. What is striking is how little resistance people offered to this transformation. Unlike invasions or disasters, there was no enemy to fight, no sudden calamity to rebuild from. The river's departure was too gradual, too natural, and so it was met with quiet acceptance. In time, this acceptance grew into identity. A child born a generation after the river left did not see herself as deprived, but as part of a town known for its fields or its schools rather than for its boats. Over the course of centuries, what had once been remembered with longing became instead a distant legend, a story told in hushed tones by elders who spoke of a river that once flowed at the town's feet. Archaeologists and historians who study these places describe them with a certain melancholy, yet also with fascination. They find remnants of docks where no water has touched for hundreds of years, shards of pottery bearing the marks of distant lands, coins from merchants who once tied their vessels at the harbor. These artifacts whisper of connections long gone, showing how a town once thrived within a larger world. Yet what is equally fascinating is what replaced them. traces of farming tools, wells dug deeper, barns built over old market squares. In these layers, one sees adaptation, the slow redirection of human life to meet new realities. Nature, too, left marks of its own. Oxbow lakes formed where the river had once meandered, leaving behind crescent-shaped waters that sparkled quietly under the sun. These lakes became sanctuaries for birds and fish, inviting life where commerce had once dominated. Travelers centuries later described them as beautiful, serene, places where one could sense both the presence and absence of the river. To walk along their edges was to feel the passage of time itself, for every curve of the land told the story of a current that had carved, retreated, and left behind silence. What may surprise us is how many such towns still exist today. Across Europe, Asia, Africa, and the Americas, one can find communities whose streets seem too wide for their present population, whose churches seem too grand for their quiet congregations. These traces are the echoes of a time when the river granted them wealth and importance. To visit them now is to step into a landscape of memory, where every stone, every empty warehouse, every meadow was once alive with waterborne life. The persistence of these towns shows the human tendency not to abandon lightly, but to remain rooted even when circumstances shift. Families stayed because their ancestors were buried there, because the soil was familiar, because the houses built by great-grandparents still stood. This deep connection to place reveals something about human endurance. We do not thrive only where prosperity flows. We also endure where history settles. And so, when we reflect on these towns left behind by changing rivers, we are reminded that history is not only about progress or decline, but about transformation. The river continues to flow elsewhere, and new towns rise on its banks, but the old ones remain, quieter, gentler, layered with stories. As you drift toward sleep, imagine yourself walking through such a town at dawn. The streets are still, the sky just beginning to lighten, and in the distance, the faint line of the old river is visible as a band of darker green across the land. The silence feels almost sacred, as if the town itself is whispering its story, not with drama, but with patience. In this quiet, you understand that time does not erase, but reshapes, and that even places left behind carry meaning, dignity, and peace. In the quiet endurance of these forgotten river towns, there lies a subtle but important lesson about the way human beings live with change. For many centuries, people assumed that rivers, though prone to flooding or drought, were eternal features of the landscape. A child raised beside the flowing water might have believed it would always be there, just as the sun rose each morning and the seasons turned in predictable cycles. Yet the gradual shifting of a river's course revealed how fragile those assumptions could be. Towns built with confidence in their permanence found themselves left on the margins, disconnected from the lifeline that had given them purpose. Still, they did not vanish entirely. Instead, they became quieter, more introspective, living on as shadows of their former selves. Imagine standing in such a town during the 17th or 18th century, long after the main river had shifted away. The market square is still present, its stones worn smooth by centuries of footsteps. But fewer stalls stand there now. A handful of merchants sell bread, cloth, and tools, but the exotic goods that once arrived on boats are nowhere to be seen. The docks have collapsed into reeds, and children use the old timbers as playthings. Farmers drive carts along dusty roads that were once busy with traders. Leading horses to the water, life continues, yet the air carries a faint echo of something greater that once was. Some travelers passing through such towns recorded their impressions in journals. They spoke of wide, empty streets, of grand buildings now housing only a few families, of churches where the congregation gathered in a space too large for their numbers. The melancholy was unmistakable, yet many travelers also noted a sense of peace. These towns, though diminished, seemed unhurried. Without the constant bustle of trade, they became places of quiet reflection where one could rest from the noise of larger cities. In this way, what was lost in activity was gained in stillness. Generations grew accustomed to this rhythm. To the children who grew up in these centuries, the river was already distant, a line of green on the horizon. They accepted it as natural, never knowing the urgency their ancestors had felt when boats crowded the harbor. For them, the town's identity lay not in commerce, but in continuity. The same houses, the same fields, the same traditions repeated year after year, and so a new kind of permanence took shape, one not based on prosperity, but on patience. In the natural world, the abandoned channels of rivers developed lives of their own. Meadows flourished where water had once flowed, wildflowers spread across silt-rich soil, and birds found homes in oxbow lakes that glittered quietly in the sun. What had once been the domain of merchants and sailors became the realm of herons, fish, and reeds. The town, though diminished, became part of a broader landscape of balance between human memory and natural reclamation. In many ways, these scenes reflect a broader truth about history itself. Change does not always come as thunder or fire. Often it comes as silence, as gradual erosion, as the steady redirection of forces beyond human control. The towns left behind by rivers are monuments to this kind of change, teaching us that endurance sometimes matters more than triumph. To walk their streets today is to feel the weight of centuries in every stone, to see how lives adapt to loss and how memory lingers, even when the water has gone. As you close your eyes and drift further into rest, picture yourself standing at the edge of one such town at night. The stars reflect faintly in the distance where the river once ran. The fields are quiet, and the only sound is the gentle whisper of wind through tall grass. You feel the presence of time, not as a burden, but as a soft blanket, wrapping the town and its stories in stillness. In this quiet place, you sense how history flows like the river itself, sometimes moving away, sometimes returning in memory, always shaping but never entirely erasing. The story of the towns abandoned by their rivers is not only about the past, but also about the way we remember and reinterpret history. For centuries after the water had shifted, local people continued to tell stories about how life once was, weaving the memory of the river into folktales, songs, and even proverbs. A grandmother might rock a child to sleep while singing about the days when lanterns floated down the current during midsummer festivals, even though that child had never seen the river within the town's borders. A farmer might carve into wood the outline of a boat, placing it above his door as a reminder of the vessels his ancestors once guided into the harbor. In this way, memory replaced presence, and culture preserved what nature had erased. Historians who visited such towns in later centuries often noted this contrast. They described the strange experience of walking through places that looked like pastoral villages, yet carried the names and traditions of ports. One scholar wrote of a church service in which the priest spoke of blessings for fishermen, though no one in the congregation had fished in living memory. Another described a yearly festival in which paper boats were floated on ponds, formed from abandoned riverbeds, the people laughing and celebrating, as though the river had never left. These customs revealed how deeply identity was tied to water, and how unwilling communities were to let go of the bond even after it had dissolved. Economically, many of these towns became modest but self-sufficient. Where once caravans and boats arrived daily, the rhythm shifted to seasonal harvests and small-scale trade. Families relied more on their own labor and less on outside goods. Life became simpler, less varied, but also less volatile. Without the river's constant flow of strangers and merchants, disputes grew fewer, and many towns described as declining by outsiders were experienced as peaceful by those who lived there. The sense of decline, then, was often a matter of perspective. To a merchant seeking opportunity, a quiet river town was a disappointment. But to a farmer raising his family in stability, it was a refuge. This duality shaped the way such towns were remembered, as lost by some, as enduring by others. The land itself told the story in its own way. Over time, the old riverbeds filled with soil and grass, their outlines still visible from above as faint curves across the landscape. Farmers plowed these lines, planting wheat or barley where ships once floated. In some cases, the soil proved especially fertile, enriched by centuries of silt. Thus, what was lost in trade was regained in harvest. A field of golden grain shimmering under the sun stood where once sails had gleamed in the breeze. Such transformations were reminders that nothing is ever truly empty. What departs in one form often returns in another. Travelers centuries later often reported a dreamlike quality to these towns. They seemed suspended between two worlds, one of active memory where the river still lived in stories, and one of present reality where life unfolded without it. walking down streets that ended abruptly in meadows, or seeing bridges that spanned nothing but grass, gave the impression of stepping into a forgotten chapter of history. And yet the people were not sad. They smiled, they worked, they celebrated. They had learned to live with absence, to fold it into daily life until it became simply another part of who they were. As you let your breath slow and your body sink deeper into rest, imagine yourself wandering such a town at twilight. The houses are simple but sturdy, their windows glowing softly with lamplight. The air smells of tilled earth, not of river water, yet the silence carries a rhythm as if the current still flowed invisibly. You come upon the remains of an old dock, now covered with wildflowers, and you pause to listen. There is no sound of water, but you feel the memory of it, the sense that time once moved differently here. In this moment, you understand that history does not vanish. It transforms, and in that transformation lies both loss and peace. The towns abandoned by the changing river continued to evolve in subtle ways, long after outsiders had ceased to take notice. By the 19th century, many of these places were seen as curiosities, remnants of a bygone era when waterways ruled the economy. Travelers who reached them by road often wrote about their strange mixture of grandeur and quiet decay. They would enter a village with wide streets that seemed too large for the handful of carts that still used them, or pass a stone bridge arching gracefully over nothing but grass and wildflowers. The impression was always one of stillness, as though time had slowed to a different pace in these forgotten corners. Yet for the residents, life was not unusual. To them, the absence of the river was normal, and their routines were shaped around farming, herding, and the small crafts that kept families fed. Their identity as former river towns survived mostly in memory and tradition. A yearly festival might still feature symbols of boats or water, though no one alive had ever sailed from the old harbor. An inn might still bear the name of the Dockside Tavern, even though the dock itself had collapsed generations before. These fragments of language and custom kept alive the knowledge of what had been, even as daily life moved on without the river's presence. Historians who studied these communities noted that their persistence offered a lesson about human resilience. Rather than abandon their homes when fortune declined, people adjusted expectations, living with less but maintaining continuity. The story was not of disappearance, but of transformation, of how human beings adapt quietly to changes too large to resist. Economically, these towns became modest, often relying on agriculture more than trade. The soil enriched by centuries of river silt proved fertile, yielding crops that sustained the population. Families lived simply, rarely wealthy, but rarely starving. Their world became smaller, their connections fewer, yet they endured. Visitors sometimes described them as backward or stagnant, but within the towns themselves, life felt stable, even comforting. The absence of the river was no longer a wound, but simply a fact, like the shape of the hills or the color of the sky. The natural environment continued its slow reclamation. Former channels became marshes alive with reeds and birds. Oxbow lakes formed tranquil refuges, where fishermen cast lines not for profit, but for leisure. Forests crept back into areas once cleared for docks and warehouses. What had once been commerce became wilderness, and in that wilderness lay a different kind of richness. The river itself, far away, continued to flow in new courses, carrying with it the bustling trade that had once belonged to these towns. But its absence did not mean an end. It meant that the land and its people had entered a new relationship with time. Modern travelers, stumbling upon such a place, might feel they had entered another age. Streets lined with old stone houses appeared almost frozen, their doors weathered, their gardens filled with herbs. A church bell might still ring, though only a small group gathered to hear it. In the quiet of such moments, one could sense the deep layering of history, how centuries of change had settled like sediment. To walk there was to feel not loss, but continuity, the endurance of a community that refused to vanish even when the world around it had shifted. As you drift further into rest tonight, imagine wandering through such a town at dawn. The sky glows pale, the fields shimmer with dew, and the silence is filled with the distant hum of insects. You follow a path to the old riverbank, where stones still mark the outline of the dock. You sit among the grasses and listen, not to the sound of water, but to the stillness itself. And in that stillness, you sense the truth that history is not always written in battles and empires, but also in the quiet survival of places left behind. places where memory flows more deeply than rivers. In the final reflection on the towns left behind by the changing river, it becomes clear that their story is not simply about decline, but about the long patience of history. While bustling cities rose elsewhere, powered by new river channels, canals, and eventually railroads, these towns carried on quietly, existing in the shadow of their former importance. Yet their endurance was not meaningless. They became places where memory and presence coexisted, where every stone and street corner held echoes of a past that had not been erased, but simply transformed. Imagine walking through such a town today. The houses stand weathered yet sturdy, built of stone and timber that has absorbed centuries of wind and sun. Some buildings lean slightly, their beams creaking with age, but they remain standing as though determined to outlast time itself. You walk down a broad street that seems too wide for the handful of residents who pass by. Children chase one another in laughter, their voices carrying into the still air, unaware that their footsteps echo over ground once trodden by merchants from faraway lands. At the edge of town, you come across the remains of the old dock. It is overgrown with grass and wildflowers, the stones uneven, yet the outline is unmistakable. You pause there and try to imagine the site as it once was. Ships tied to the posts, barrels rolled across planks, the smell of spices and wood, the calls of sailors. Now the only sound is the hum of bees and the rustle of reeds, and yet the memory lingers as if the river itself still whispers through the air. For the people who remain, life is measured not by grandeur, but by continuity. They plant fields enriched by the silt left behind. They draw water from wells dug deep into the ground. They celebrate festivals that remember a river few have seen. Their identity is not lost, but reshaped, turning from outward connection to inward resilience. Outsiders may call it decline, but those who live here know it as home. They walk daily past the same churches, the same fields, the same pathways, knowing that their roots run deeper than the flow of water. Historians and travelers alike have found in these places a kind of wisdom. They remind us that prosperity is never permanent, that landscapes change regardless of human desire, and that survival often comes not from resisting change, but from absorbing it, adapting quietly over generations. The lesson is one of humility and patience, qualities that flow as slowly as the rivers that once gave these towns life. Nature, too, has claimed its place in this balance. Birds nest in the reeds of old channels. Foxes cross the meadows where boats once sailed, and wildflowers bloom where markets once rang with voices. What was once commerce is now serenity. What was once urgency is now stillness. And in this transformation lies beauty, for history is not always loud. Sometimes it is soft, slow, and nearly invisible. As you prepare to drift fully into sleep, imagine the stillness of such a town at night. The sky above is filled with stars, reflected faintly in the shallow pools that remain of the old riverbed. The air is cool, carrying the faint scent of earth and grass. Houses glow dimly with candlelight, their windows flickering against the dark. You hear the distant toll of a bell marking the hour, though time feels unimportant here. What matters is the quiet, the continuity, the way the town exists as a bridge between past and present. In this silence, you feel the truth that history is not only in grand events, but also in the persistence of ordinary people who continue where they are, who live their lives even after the river has moved on. The towns left behind are not ruins, but reminders, teaching us that change does not erase, but reshapes, and that life carries on in new forms. And so, as your breathing slows and your mind grows heavy, you rest in the calm of these stories, letting the gentle flow of time carry you toward dreams, just as rivers once carried boats, and just as memory now carries us through the landscapes of history. And so, dear friends, our story has come to an end. Before we move on to the next journey, may I gently ask you to give this video a like and subscribe to the channel. Your support helps keep these quiet stories alive each night. Now, let us continue with another tale in our series of boring history for sleep. The final candle in the last Roman villa. In the fading centuries of the Roman Empire, long after legions had marched triumphantly across distant provinces and senators had debated in marble halls, there remained small corners of life that carried on quietly, almost unnoticed. Among these, scattered across the countryside of Italy and beyond, stood villas, once symbols of wealth and culture. gradually turning into relics of another age. Tonight we begin with one such villa, imagined in its twilight years, when the empire itself was crumbling, but daily routines still unfolded in silence. The villa was large but no longer new. Its mosaics were chipped, its walls bore cracks from long seasons of rain, and yet in the evenings it glowed faintly with lamplight, offering a final echo of the grandeur that had once defined Rome. Imagine walking through its atrium, where once fountains played and guests gathered in brilliant conversation. Now the fountain is dry, the marble slightly stained, and the conversation reduced to whispers of a family clinging to old customs. The air is still fragrant with herbs from the garden, but the laughter of banquets has long faded. What remains is a quieter dignity, a sense of people determined to keep traditions alive, even as the world around them changes. The family within the villa lived simply compared to their ancestors. The father read scrolls in the dim light, though fewer arrived each year as trade diminished. The mother tended to the weaving of garments, using wool from their own sheep rather than silk brought from faraway lands. Children played in the courtyard with carved wooden toys, their voices filling spaces that once echoed with the footsteps of statesmen and philosophers. Servants who had once numbered in dozens were now only a handful, loyal more from shared endurance than from duty. The villa was no longer a seat of power, but a place of memory, standing stubbornly against the erosion of time. Beyond the villa's walls, the countryside had changed too. Roads once busy with soldiers and merchants now saw only occasional travelers, their cloaks worn, their steps uncertain. The fields produced less, as irrigation systems fell into disrepair. Towns nearby shrank, their markets quieter, their theaters abandoned. Yet life did not vanish. Farmers still planted grain, shepherds still guided flocks, and in the evening smoke rose gently from hearths. The empire might have weakened, but human persistence endured. Within the villa, the most enduring symbol of this persistence was a simple candle. Each evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, a servant lit it and placed it in a bronze holder that had been polished for generations. The candle burned softly, casting light over the fading frescoes and the worn stone floors. It was not the bright glow of torches or the grand illumination of feasts. It was a single flame, steady and fragile, standing against the vast shadow of decline. To those who lived there, it was ordinary, a routine gesture to push back the dark. To us, it is a symbol of how, even at the edge of collapse, people continue to light small flames, carrying forward their lives with dignity. Imagine yourself sitting in that villa at dusk. The rooms grow colder, the sounds of the countryside drift through the open windows, and the candle flickers gently, its light reflecting on the bronze, its wax melting slowly. Around you are the objects of a culture that once ruled much of the known world: a cracked amphora, a half-broken statue, a mosaic of gods whose faces are fading. Yet within this quiet space, there is no despair, only stillness. Life continues in smaller ways, measured not by empire, but by family, by daily rituals, by the quiet determination to endure. As you let your eyes grow heavy, picture that candle burning through the night, the final candle in the last Roman villa, illuminating not glory, but persistence, not conquest, but continuity. It is a reminder that history is not only written in triumphs and battles, but also in the quiet refusal to let darkness take everything at once. The villa, standing in its final centuries, carried not only the presence of a family, but also the weight of traditions that stretched back to Rome's greatest days. Though the empire had fractured and the authority of emperors faded into distant rumors, daily rituals within its walls followed a rhythm that belonged to a time when order still seemed eternal. Each morning, the household rose with the light, servants carrying bread baked from grain harvested nearby, while the master walked slowly across the courtyard, pausing to greet the household gods whose statues still stood in small alcoves. These statues were chipped and weathered, yet they were polished with care, as though by preserving them, the family could also preserve their link to the past. The villa's library, once filled with scrolls brought from distant provinces, was now sparse. Trade routes had broken down, roads were less safe, and scribes rarely passed through. Yet the master continued to read from what he had, unrolling worn scrolls of Virgil and Cicero, his voice echoing faintly in rooms where once students and tutors debated philosophy. The children listened sometimes, though their understanding was limited. For them, the stories of empire sounded almost mythical, tales of soldiers marching across endless lands and senators commanding the fates of nations. Their world was smaller, bounded by fields and hills, yet they inherited the shadow of greatness like a distant echo. Outside, the countryside bore marks of neglect. Aqueducts once carrying water across valleys now stood broken, their arches crumbling into the weeds. Roads lined with paving stones were cracked, grass pushing through where once legions had marched. Farmers struggled with smaller harvests, but they planted again each season, driven not by empire, but by necessity. Life narrowed into survival, yet within that survival lay its own dignity. At dusk, when the fields were quiet, the villa gathered around its hearth. The candle was lit once more, casting its gentle glow, and the family shared bread, olives, and cheese while listening to the faint sounds of the night beyond the walls. In that small circle of light, the vastness of decline seemed distant. They did not speak of the empire's fall as scholars might. They spoke of the weather, the crops, the health of neighbors. History's grand shifts passed around them like storms on the horizon, but within the villa, life was anchored in the ordinary. Travelers who occasionally reached such villas described them with a mixture of surprise and melancholy. To arrive at a house that still bore mosaics and columns, yet stood amid overgrown fields and quiet villages, was to feel the contrast between past splendor and present endurance. Some visitors recorded the hospitality they received, a generosity rooted in customs that had outlasted political power. Others wrote of the stillness, the sense that time itself had slowed. For those who lived there, the candlelight each evening was simply part of survival, a way to keep darkness at bay. For us, it becomes a symbol, representing the persistence of human dignity, even in decline. Imagine walking through those halls as night deepens. The air grows cooler, the candle flickers against the frescoes of fading gods and heroes, and outside the sound of crickets fills the silence. The villa seems both fragile and eternal, a fragment of a world that refuses to vanish completely. You pause by the library, where scrolls lie stacked though many are unread, and you sense the presence of countless voices preserved in words. Beyond, the courtyard lies empty, its fountain dry but still graceful. In every stone you feel the memory of empire, but in the candle's glow you feel something deeper, the quiet determination to continue life, even when greatness has passed away. As the years moved on, the villa became less a place of grandeur and more a quiet refuge, a space where memory lingered even as the outside world grew unsteady. The empire's provinces fractured, armies marched across borders, and cities once secure found themselves subject to raids. Yet within the villa's walls, life carried on, in diminished but familiar ways. The family no longer received guests from distant lands, nor did they host the great banquets of earlier centuries, but they gathered faithfully around their evening meal, the small candle glowing at the center of the table. That candle, humble and fragile, became the heart of their existence. Each evening its flame lit the room, illuminating faded frescoes that once told stories of gods and victories. Now those images looked ghostly, their colors pale, their outlines blurred by time. Yet the family still paused to look at them, as though the very act of remembering lent strength to their present. The children, who had never known the empire in its glory, listened to stories told by elders. They learned of emperors and generals, of roads that reached the ends of the earth, of markets filled with goods from Africa and Asia. To them it was half history, half myth, for their own lives were filled not with bustling trade, but with simple routines, feeding animals, harvesting grain, preparing bread. They had never seen the sea that had once connected Rome to distant provinces, but in their minds they sailed it every evening through the words spoken by their parents and grandparents. Beyond the villa, the countryside was a patchwork of survival. Villages dotted the hills, fields stretched in quiet rows, and old Roman roads still carried occasional travelers, though grass grew between the stones. Bands of wanderers sometimes passed, seeking food or shelter, and the villa, though cautious, offered what it could, bound by customs of hospitality. Yet each encounter reminded the family that the old order was gone, replaced by uncertainty. The aqueducts nearby had long since crumbled, their arches rising like skeletons against the horizon. Wells provided water, though less freely than before. The bathhouse, once a place of social life, stood empty, its pools cracked, its floors covered in dust. And yet the villa endured. Its endurance was not dramatic, not heroic in the sense of battle, but steady and human. The lighting of the candle each evening symbolized this endurance, a small defiance against the creeping dark. Travelers who found shelter there later described the experience of sitting in its atrium at night, listening to the flame flicker while hearing stories of a world that seemed to be slipping away. For them, the villa was like a living monument, not grand but deeply moving in its persistence. Imagine yourself walking through those halls on such a night. The stone walls are cool, the air faintly scented with herbs from the garden, and the candlelight dances across mosaics of long-forgotten deities. You pass through the empty triclinium, once filled with laughter and music, now silent except for the creak of timbers in the roof. You reach the courtyard, where the stars shine above the broken fountain, and you pause to listen to the night insects singing in the grass. The silence is heavy, yet it is not despairing. It is the silence of a world that has accepted change, that has given up grandeur but not life. The candle burns steadily in its bronze holder, fragile yet sufficient, carrying forward one more night in the long decline of empire. In that fragile flame lies the story of countless families who endured the fading of Rome, not with battles or proclamations, but with patience, with daily rituals, with the quiet strength to continue. The villa in its later years stood as a symbol of both decline and resilience, a place where the remnants of Roman civilization lingered in fragile continuity. Its walls, though weathered by seasons of wind and rain, still carried the outlines of painted gods, heroes, and scenes of prosperity. The family who remained inside did not live with wealth, yet they lived with memory, and in that memory there was dignity. Each day unfolded in quiet repetition, a rhythm so steady that the chaos beyond the hills seemed like a distant rumor. The father tended to the fields with his sons, coaxing harvest from soil that had once fed banquets of the empire. The mother oversaw weaving and the keeping of household stores, ensuring that bread, oil, and wool were preserved against the leaner months. Servants had dwindled to only a few, but those who remained had become like kin, sharing the burdens of survival in exchange for belonging to the last echo of a once grand tradition. At night, the candle was lit again, its small flame the single point of brilliance in a house built for many more lights. Around its glow, the family gathered to eat and to speak of simple matters. The health of animals, the yield of crops, the approach of winter. Sometimes, when the night was long, they recited verses from old scrolls, though the younger children understood only fragments. These verses, whether of Virgil or Homer, sounded less like literature and more like prayers to a world that was fading. Beyond the villa, the landscape bore its own testimony. Roads cracked by neglect wound through fields where weeds encroached. Villas nearby had already fallen, their stones carried off by villagers to build cottages. In one direction, the arches of a broken aqueduct stretched against the horizon, standing silent like a monument to forgotten engineering. In another direction lay the ruins of a bathhouse, its once splendid mosaics dulled and covered with dust. Yet in the villa itself, order persisted in miniature, the repetition of daily acts serving as a thread connecting past to present. Travelers who passed by often remarked on the atmosphere of these lingering houses. They felt as if they had entered a place where time moved differently, where the empire still breathed faintly in candlelight, though its voice had gone silent elsewhere. Some described it as eerie, others as comforting, but all agreed that such villas embodied the stubborn endurance of a people who refused to vanish completely. The candle was central to this impression. Lit each evening as the sun faded, it burned with a fragile steadiness that seemed to defy the decline around it. It did not blaze with brilliance. It flickered, wavered, but endured until the wax was gone. Visitors often recalled watching it in silence, feeling that they were witnessing not only a household's routine, but the symbol of a civilization in its final glow. Imagine walking through its halls at such an hour. The shadows lengthen across cracked marble floors. The air grows cool, and the flame casts golden light over walls scarred by time. You see a child leaning drowsily against her mother, her small face illuminated by the glow. You hear the creak of wood in the rafters, the distant bark of a dog beyond the gate, the steady hum of insects outside. Everything feels fragile, and yet the fragility is beautiful, for it carries the weight of centuries distilled into one quiet moment. The empire had marched, conquered, and ruled, but in the end, its persistence lay in this. a family keeping a single candle burning in a villa far from the centers of power, preserving continuity through the most ordinary of rituals. And as you imagine this scene, let your breathing slow and your body grow heavy, for the story of the last Roman villa is not about endings, but about the endurance of light in darkness, about the way history narrows into memory, and about how memory itself can become a form of survival. By the time generations had passed within the villa, the world outside had changed so much that the grandeur of Rome was remembered only as distant story, rather than lived memory. Yet inside those walls, the patterns of life persisted, shaped by habit more than by ambition. The villa no longer echoed with the voices of senators or the music of banquets, but it did echo with the quieter sounds of survival, the scraping of a hoe in the fields, the rhythmic turning of a spindle, the laughter of children playing in courtyards where weeds grew between the stones. Every act within the villa became a continuation of what had been, a way of keeping the thread unbroken even as the fabric of empire frayed. The master of the house was no longer a statesman, but a farmer. His authority measured not by political decree, but by how well he could secure harvests and guide his family through lean winters. His library contained fewer scrolls, yet he still opened them in the evenings, reading aloud passages from Virgil or Seneca, his voice quiet under the flicker of the candle. The children listened in silence, not always grasping the words but sensing their importance, as if through repetition they too could inherit the dignity of Rome. The mother oversaw the weaving of garments, her hands moving steadily as she turned wool from their sheep into warm clothing. In her labor there was no grandeur, but there was resilience, a persistence that kept her household clothed through every season. The servants, though reduced in number, shared in this rhythm, no longer bound by fear of masters, but by mutual survival. And in this way, the villa transformed from an estate of dominance to a household of shared endurance. Beyond the gates, the countryside carried reminders of what had been. Roads still stretched across hills, but they were broken in places, grass filling the gaps between stones where once legions had marched. The aqueducts loomed in silence, their channels dry, their arches casting long shadows in the setting sun. Nearby villages had grown where once only fields existed, their cottages built from stones carried away from abandoned villas. Life reorganized itself around new centers, but the old villa still stood, like a stubborn sentinel of memory. To travelers who occasionally found shelter there, it was a place of strange melancholy. They noted how wide the halls were compared to the few who walked them, how grand the mosaics seemed even though their colors had dulled, how the candle at night seemed too small to fill so much space, yet somehow sufficient. They described meals of bread, olives, and cheese eaten under frescoes of gods, whose stories the family still remembered, though they no longer commanded the world. For these travelers, the villa was a lesson in impermanence, a reminder that greatness is fragile, and that what endures in the end is not glory, but persistence. Imagine yourself in such a place as evening falls. The courtyard grows dim, the fountain stands dry, and the candle is lit once more in its bronze holder. Shadows stretch across cracked marble floors, and the flame dances gently against walls that hold centuries of memory. Outside, the night fills with the sound of crickets, the distant call of an owl, the rustle of leaves. Inside, a family gathers in silence, their faces calm, their presence steady. The candle burns low, its wax melting slowly, its flame unwavering. You sit among them, feeling the weight of history, not as noise, but as quiet continuity. The empire has passed, but life continues, carried forward by those who keep the flame alive through simple rituals. In that moment, you understand that the final candle in the last Roman villa is not merely a light against darkness, but a symbol of the human spirit, enduring with patience even as the world changes around it. As the seasons turned and decades passed, the villa aged further, its stones settling deeper into the earth, its gardens growing wilder, yet its life persisted in a steady rhythm. What had once been a grand estate was now more like a fortified farmhouse, a place where memory lingered in every room, but where daily existence was measured in small, ordinary tasks. The morning began with the sound of footsteps in the courtyard. The bleating of sheep led to pasture, the creak of wooden doors as tools were carried out for work. The walls that had once echoed with the conversations of scholars and statesmen now absorbed the simpler voices of children learning chores, mothers teaching daughters to weave, fathers instructing sons to mend fences. Yet within these smaller tasks lay the persistence of Roman culture, carried forward not by armies or emperors, but by families clinging to continuity. The candle, lit faithfully each evening, remained the central ritual. It was no longer just a source of light, but a marker of identity. When it flickered against the cracked mosaics, it seemed to animate the fading images, breathing life into the gods and heroes whose outlines still decorated the walls. To the family, the candle was as necessary as bread or water, a sign that night could be met with steadiness rather than fear. Even when storms swept across the countryside, rattling shutters and shaking the old timbers of the roof, the candle burned on, a small flame carrying centuries of tradition. Beyond the villa, the world continued to shift. The empire had fractured into kingdoms, alliances rose and fell, new peoples migrated across lands that had once flown Rome's banners. But the villa stood apart from such tides, touched only indirectly, when travelers passed by with news of battles fought in distant provinces. For the family inside, these stories were distant murmurs, less urgent than the harvest, the health of livestock, or the mending of walls after winter's rains. Their survival depended not on the fate of kings, but on their own endurance. Travelers who found their way to the villa often wrote of its atmosphere of quiet melancholy. They described wide halls where a single candle seemed to hold back endless shadows, of gardens overgrown yet fragrant, of a sense of dignity clinging to ruins that refused to collapse. They noted the courtesy of the household, who offered bread and shelter despite having little themselves, as though hospitality was the last treasure they could still give. To those travelers, the villa was a living reminder of a world gone by, a fragment of Rome preserved not in monuments, but in daily rituals. Imagine walking those halls as evening falls. You pass rooms where frescoes are faint but still visible, showing gods and myths that once inspired empires. You step into the courtyard where weeds climb between the paving stones, and the fountain stands dry. Yet the shape of its basin still holds the memory of flowing water. You sit with the family as the candle is lit, watching its flame push back the darkness inch by inch. The silence is deep but not empty. It is filled with the quiet pulse of continuity. In that moment, you understand that the last Roman villa was less about grandeur and more about resilience. It was not the wealth of marble or the sweep of power that endured, but the simple act of lighting a candle, night after night, refusing to let darkness erase memory. This flame, small and unassuming, carried with it the weight of centuries, a final glow of a civilization transformed, but never entirely gone. As more generations passed, the villa became not only a home, but also a quiet monument to endurance. The empire itself was spoken of as legend, a distant time when legions marched across continents and emperors commanded cities of marble. But within the villa, that grandeur lived on in fragments. A carved pillar that still held its place, a mosaic floor where faded images of Neptune shimmered faintly under dust, the careful ritual of lighting the candle each evening. What had once been ordinary practice now carried the weight of memory. Each flame was a link to ancestors who had done the same when the empire was strong. The children who grew up within those walls knew little of empire beyond the stories told at night. To them, Rome was not soldiers or senators, but the symbols etched into stone, the words recited from worn scrolls, and the quiet pride their parents held in preserving traditions. They learned to farm, to mend tools, to care for animals, but they also learned to bow their heads as the candle was lit, honoring not gods of empire, but the simple endurance of their family. Beyond the villa, the world continued its restless change. New kingdoms rose and fell, battles were fought on distant fields, languages shifted, yet the villa remained, stubborn in its stillness. Roads grew rougher, aqueducts collapsed further, and many neighboring estates disappeared altogether, their stones scattered into villages. Yet this villa held its form, because those who lived there believed it was more than stone. It was a memory they were entrusted to guard. To travelers who stumbled upon it, the impression was unforgettable. They described approaching through wild fields to find a structure both ruined and alive, with columns leaning but still upright, and light glowing faintly within at night. They told of being welcomed with bread and oil, seated in rooms too large for the small household that occupied them, and listening as the master recited lines from ancient poets by candlelight. The scene felt like stepping back into another world, where fragments of Rome still breathed despite the centuries that had passed. Imagine walking through such a place at dusk. The air is cool, scented with earth and herbs from an overgrown garden. You step across cracked tiles, their patterns still visible beneath moss, and you hear the faint laughter of children echoing where once musicians played for banquets. You enter a chamber where the candle has just been lit, its glow soft against stone walls that carry centuries of memory. Shadows dance across frescoes of gods whose names you barely recall, and for a moment it feels as though time itself has slowed to let you witness this fragile survival. The candle burns quietly, its flame steady despite the draft of the old walls. You watch as it reflects in the eyes of those gathered, binding them together in a ritual that has outlasted armies, rulers, and the collapse of empire. The candle is not grand, but it is enough. It carries the essence of Rome, not through conquest, but through continuity, through the quiet refusal to let light fade entirely. And as night deepens, you feel the weight of history settling like a blanket, comforting in its persistence, reminding you that even when civilizations pass, the human spirit finds ways to endure through the smallest of flames. The villa lingered into centuries, when the world around it was almost unrecognizable from the Rome that had first built it. Once its walls had echoed with discussions of politics and trade, but now they carried only the sounds of daily survival, of footsteps on worn stone, and the soft flicker of a candle at night. To those who lived within, it was not a ruin, but a home, though much of its grandeur had faded. Roofs sagged, gardens grew wild, mosaics were dulled by dust, yet the rhythm of life continued. Each morning began with the same simple acts: tending animals, gathering firewood, drawing water from the well, baking bread. These tasks may have seemed humble, yet they were threads binding the present to the past. Every evening, as the sun disappeared beyond the hills, the ritual of lighting the candle persisted. Its flame illuminated more than walls. It illuminated memory itself, stretching back to a time when villas like this dotted the countryside as symbols of Rome's wealth and order. The candle had no grandeur, yet it held significance far beyond its size. It represented not empire, but continuity, the refusal to let darkness erase all traces of what had been. To the children of the villa, this nightly act was both ordinary and sacred. They watched as the flame took hold of the wick, listened to the quiet crackle, and felt a comfort that came from knowing their family would gather under its glow just as their ancestors had. The world outside continued to shift, kingdoms rising and falling, languages blending, villages growing where once great estates had stood. Travelers spoke of wars and rulers, but those stories mattered less here than the certainty of planting fields in spring and storing grain for winter. For the villa's inhabitants, the candle was their empire, a steady flame that outlasted chaos. Visitors who stumbled upon the villa often described the strangeness of it. Approaching through quiet fields, they found columns leaning but still upright, gardens overgrown yet still fragrant, and rooms too vast for the small household that occupied them. At night, they witnessed the candle burning in chambers, once designed for feasts and debates, now filled with silence. They ate bread and olives while listening to recitations of poetry from scrolls so worn they threatened to crumble. They felt they were not only guests in a household, but participants in the final act of a civilization that refused to disappear entirely. Imagine standing in the atrium on such a night. The air is cool, carrying the scent of damp earth, the fountain long dry but still graceful in its emptiness. Shadows stretch across cracked marble as the candle flickers in its bronze holder. Around you, voices speak softly, their tone calm, unhurried, as though time itself has slowed inside these walls. You sense that every gesture, the breaking of bread, the turning of a page, the glance toward fading frescoes, is part of a ritual far older than those who perform it. The candle burns steadily, its light fragile yet persistent, a final glow of Rome that refuses to fade completely. And as you imagine this scene, let yourself feel the weight of quiet endurance. The villa is not triumphant, not powerful, but it is alive, carrying memory forward one night at a time. In the small flame, you see the persistence of human dignity, a reminder that even in decline, there is grace, and that history does not vanish suddenly, but lingers in fragile rituals, flickering gently against the vastness of the night. As the villa endured into later centuries, it became less a remnant of empire and more a quiet testament to the stubbornness of human presence. The great tides of history moved around it. Kingdoms rose, armies clashed, new religions spread across the land. But within its walls, the rhythm remained steady, almost indifferent to the storms beyond. Its inhabitants no longer thought of themselves as Romans in the way their ancestors had, yet they held to customs and habits that tied them invisibly to the past. The candle lit each evening was the clearest symbol of this bond. Its flame was never grand, yet it was consistent, the one detail that remained unchanged even as the villa aged and the world transformed. Imagine the villa on a winter's night. The wind rattles the shutters, the stone walls release the chill of centuries, but in the center of the room the candle burns quietly, casting a circle of warmth. The family gathers around it, wrapped in woolen cloaks, their faces calm. They eat bread dipped in oil, share stories, and listen as one elder recites lines from ancient verse. The children, their eyes heavy with sleep, hear words they do not fully understand yet absorb the cadence, the sense of belonging to a story longer than their own. Outside, the world is restless. Roads are rough, villages expand, distant rulers make proclamations. But here, time slows. The candle burns down, its wax dripping, and for those who sit around it, the moment feels timeless. Visitors who found their way to the villa often remarked on this sense of timelessness. They described how stepping inside felt like walking into another era, where fragments of Rome still lived. They saw mosaics faded but not gone, frescoes chipped yet recognizable, pillars leaning yet upright. They ate modest meals but felt the weight of history in every gesture. They watched the candle flame and felt as though they were witnessing not merely light, but memory itself, preserved in ritual. To them, the villa was not just a household, but a living archive, carrying forward the essence of a world that had otherwise dissolved into legend. Beyond the villa, nature continued to reclaim the landscape. Fields stretched where roads once bustled, forests crept closer to abandoned estates, birds nested in aqueduct ruins. The empire's grand infrastructure was vanishing, but the villa's small circle of life remained. Its endurance was not about conquest or wealth, but about persistence, the refusal to let silence erase everything. Each day was ordinary, yet together those days became extraordinary, a chain of continuity that linked generations to a vanished civilization. Imagine walking the villa's corridors at dusk. You pass a cracked statue, its features worn by time, and enter a room where the candle flickers softly. You sit among the family, feeling the calm of their presence, the steadiness of their lives. The empire may be gone, but here's its final heartbeat, not in armies or laws, but in a simple flame that has never failed to be lit. And as you close your eyes, you understand that history is not only in victories and monuments, but also in these quiet acts of persistence, in the final candle burning through the centuries in the last Roman villa. In the final reflection on the last Roman villa, one must imagine how it slowly faded into the fabric of history, not through sudden destruction, but through the long, patient passing of time. Generations lived and died within its walls, each one leaving behind traces in the form of worn tools, patched garments, and memories carried in stories. The empire that had once surrounded it with power and splendor was long gone, yet the villa remained, carrying within its stones the persistence of ordinary lives. Each evening the candle was lit, its small flames steady against the gathering dark, and in that ritual the past and present touched. The villa did not fall with the empire. Instead, it lingered quietly, adapting, shrinking, softening, until it was less a seat of wealth than a sanctuary of memory. Travelers who came upon it in later centuries wrote of its atmosphere with a sense of wonder. They described walking through cracked courtyards where weeds grew between the stones, entering chambers with fading frescoes where gods seemed to look out through the dust of centuries, and sitting at night beneath the glow of a single candle that seemed too small for the vastness of the halls, yet entirely sufficient. They felt that they were witnessing the last breath of a world that refused to vanish entirely, a fragile but enduring echo of Rome. For the family that remained within, life was not about empire or history, but about survival, about keeping faith with their ancestors through repetition of small rituals. They tended their fields, cared for their animals, and gathered each night beneath the same flame. Children born into the villa inherited not power but memory, learning that the candle was more than light. It was a promise that even when greatness fades, life continues with dignity. Outside, the world shifted endlessly. Kingdoms rose and fell, languages changed, new cultures flourished, roads crumbled, aqueducts collapsed, forests reclaimed fields. Yet inside the villa there was a steadiness, a refusal to surrender completely to the erasure of time. Even as walls cracked and ceilings leaked, the candle was lit. Even as scrolls turned to dust and mosaics lost their color, the candle was lit. It became the final act of continuity, a gesture that said, "We were here and we remember." Imagine walking through the villa one last time, as night gathers. The air is cool, filled with the scent of earth and stone. The halls are quiet except for the flicker of the candle's flame. You pass the library, where fragments of words still rest on brittle parchment. You pause at the atrium, where the fountain is long dry but still graceful in its emptiness. You enter the dining chamber, where the family has gathered, their faces calm in the glow of the flame. The candle burns softly, its wax dripping slowly, its light fragile but unwavering. In that glow you see not decline, but resilience, not ruin, but continuity. The empire may have fallen, but the human spirit has not. The candle burns on, carrying memory into the silence of history. And as your eyes grow heavy, you understand the meaning of this final scene. That history is not only in the rise and fall of empires, but in the quiet persistence of people who refuse to let memory fade. The final candle in the last Roman villa did not illuminate conquest or glory. It illuminated endurance, the simple, steady light of lives lived with patience in the shadow of time. And so, dear friends, our story has come to an end. Before we move on to the next journey, may I gently ask you to give this video a like and subscribe to the channel. Your support helps keep these quiet stories alive each night. Now, let us continue with another tale in our series of Boring History for Sleep: How Languages Faded Without Anyone Noticing. When we think of the decline of great things, we often imagine sudden events, battles lost in a single day, cities collapsing under fire, or rulers overthrown in a storm of revolt. Yet in truth, many of the most profound changes in human history happened quietly, slowly, almost invisibly, so that no one could point to the moment when everything had changed. Languages belong to this quiet kind of history. They do not usually die in dramatic moments. They fade gently, replaced by other tongues, disappearing in silence as generations shift the words they use to sing, to pray, to trade, and to tell stories. Tonight, we begin with such a story, not of armies or kings, but of words themselves, and of how countless languages once spoken every day slipped away without anyone truly noticing the exact moment of their passing. Imagine a small village centuries ago, nestled among hills where farmers worked fields and children ran barefoot along dusty paths. The people spoke a language inherited from their ancestors, full of sounds shaped by local winds and rivers, by stories told at hearths, by songs carried in work and worship. This language was not written in scrolls or carved in stone. It lived in voices, in memory, in daily life. Each morning it woke in greetings. Each evening it whispered in lullabies. It was so natural, so ordinary, that no one thought it could ever vanish. And yet, beyond the village, change pressed closer. Merchants came carrying goods, speaking in another tongue. Officials arrived with decrees written in a language the villagers could not read, but learned to respect. Neighbors married outsiders, and children grew up hearing two languages at once. Slowly, imperceptibly, words shifted. A child learned to count not in the numbers of his grandparents, but in the terms of a new speech. A young woman sang an old song but replaced one word with another she had heard from a trader. The changes were small, like threads added to a cloth, barely noticeable at first, but over years the fabric itself was transformed. No one declared the old language dead. No meeting was held, no ceremony performed. It simply receded, like a river drying season by season. The elders still used it, though fewer understood them. The middle generation mixed words, creating a blend that belonged fully to neither tongue. The youngest spoke mostly in the new language, for it carried opportunity, prestige, and power. And so the old language faded quietly, its last echoes carried in prayers or curses muttered by those too old to change. Centuries later, scholars would find a few words preserved in songs or place names, fragments of a speech once vibrant and full. They would wonder how it had sounded, how it had shaped thought, how it had colored the view of the world. But the people themselves never marked its passing. They simply lived, adapting to what was useful, letting go of what seemed less so. This is the story of many languages, across continents and centuries. Latin gave way to Italian and French not in a single moment, but through centuries of change, each generation speaking slightly differently until the old tongue was gone. In the Americas, hundreds of native languages once filled forests and plains with unique sounds, but they yielded gradually under the pressure of colonial speech, until only a few words lingered in names of rivers and mountains. In Africa, in Asia, in Europe, the same story repeated. Tongues faded not in thunder, but in silence. As you let your eyes grow heavy, imagine standing in such a village at twilight. You hear an elder speaking in the old language, his words flowing like music. Yet the children nearby do not fully understand. They laugh, they play, they answer him in a newer speech. And in that exchange lies the end of a world. No one grieves, for life goes on, but something precious slips quietly into memory. This is how languages fade, without anyone noticing, without a sound of ending, only with the soft murmur of change carrying them away. To understand how languages fade without anyone noticing, one must think not in moments but in generations, for change in speech is slower than the growth of trees, yet as certain as their seasons. Imagine again a small community, perhaps in the foothills of mountains or along the bend of a river, where people have spoken the same tongue for as long as memory can reach. The language is part of every story, every prayer, every quarrel and joke. It is the fabric of belonging. But then new influences arrive, sometimes as merchants with their wares, sometimes as rulers with their officials, sometimes as priests with their sacred words. The people begin to hear another language in marketplaces, in sermons, in tax collections. At first it is only a language of outsiders, spoken at the edges of life, but gradually it moves closer. A farmer finds it easier to sell his grain if he learns a few phrases of the merchant's tongue. A child listens in church and picks up hymns in the official language. A woman marries a man from another village, and together they blend words in their household. None of these moments feel decisive, but together they form the tide of change. The old language retreats step by step, not defeated, only overshadowed. Elders continue to speak it, clinging to familiar sounds, but each year fewer children understand. Soon only fragments survive, perhaps a lullaby, perhaps a proverb, perhaps a name whispered over fields and streams. This process has repeated across centuries and continents. The Celtic languages once stretched across much of Europe, but as Latin spread through conquest and commerce, they diminished, surviving only at the far edges of the continent. In North Africa, Punic, the language of Carthage, once rivaled Latin in influence, but it faded gradually until only scholars remembered its existence. In Asia, languages spoken by tribes of vast steppes yielded slowly to the spread of larger tongues, their words buried under new layers of sound. Even in modern times, the same quiet vanishing occurs. In villages far from cities, children who move to towns adopt the national language, leaving behind the dialects of their grandparents. Within a few decades, the speech once common at hearth and harvest is gone. Scholars call it extinction, but for the families themselves, it is simply adaptation. They do not mourn in ceremonies. They adjust, speak as their neighbors speak, and allow the old words to slip quietly into silence. What makes this fading so invisible is that life continues without pause. The sun still rises, bread is still baked, songs are still sung, but the words themselves change, like garments replaced one piece at a time, until the original cloth is forgotten. Language does not fall like a city to invaders. It erodes like stone under rain, slowly, silently, until what once seemed eternal is reduced to fragments. Imagine sitting in such a village as dusk falls. An elder speaks to a grandchild in the old tongue, his words full of rhythm and memory. But the child responds in a new language, bright and clear, carrying the promise of opportunity in schools and cities. The two understand each other imperfectly, yet love bridges the gap. and so no one calls it tragedy. But listening closely, you hear history itself ending in that moment, not with sorrow, but with the gentle fading of sound. This is how languages vanish, not with violence, but with silence, slipping away unnoticed, leaving only echoes in songs, in names, and in the stories scholars later try to piece together. The fading of languages often begins with the smallest of changes, so small that they pass without comment. A borrowed word enters daily speech, perhaps first used in trade, then repeated in homes until it feels natural. A phrase once foreign becomes ordinary, and slowly the structure of a language shifts to accommodate what once was strange. Over time, sentences change shape, pronunciations soften, endings are dropped. The people do not think of themselves as abandoning their tongue. They think only of speaking as others around them do. By the time a generation has passed, the difference is clear to scholars, but invisible to those who live it. This gradual change is why languages slip away without notice. Consider the transformation of Latin into the Romance languages. No one in ancient Gaul or Iberia woke one morning to declare that Latin was dead and French or Spanish had begun. Instead, farmers, soldiers, and merchants spoke Latin in their own ways, mixing it with local dialects, altering sounds, reshaping grammar. Centuries later, the result was a family of new languages, each with its own rhythm, while Latin itself survived only in the mouths of priests and scholars. To those who lived through it, nothing ended. They were simply speaking as they always had, unaware that history was changing with every word. The same process occurred in countless places. In the British Isles, Celtic tongues retreated before the slow advance of English, not in sudden battle, but in the quiet choices of families raising children in a language that opened doors. In the Americas, native languages yielded to Spanish, Portuguese, and English, often blended at first, then gradually replaced, until only fragments remained in names of rivers, mountains, and foods. In Africa, local languages intertwined with Arabic and later European tongues, reshaping daily speech until the old forms faded into memory. What is striking is that the disappearance was rarely experienced as loss at the time. Families believed they were adapting, improving chances for their children, aligning with the future. Only later, when centuries had passed, did historians and linguists look back and see that an entire worldview expressed through sound had vanished. Each language carried not only words but ways of thinking, metaphors shaped by environment, rhythms shaped by work and worship. When the language faded, so too did subtle perspectives on the world. And yet the fading was quiet, invisible, a kind of forgetting spread across lifetimes. Imagine an evening in such a world. A grandfather sits by the fire, telling a story in the old tongue, his words thick with ancient imagery. The children listen politely, but cannot repeat his sentences. They answer him in the newer language they learn at school. The story is heard, but not carried forward in the same form. Outside, neighbors speak in yet another blend, and the air is filled with overlapping voices, none of which match the speech of centuries past. No one calls this the death of a language, yet in that firelit room, the final thread is being cut. The candle burns low, the voices fade, and a language slips quietly into silence. This is how it has always happened, and how it continues to happen still. The fading of languages is rarely sudden, for words linger long after their strength is gone, like embers glowing faintly, even when the fire has nearly burned out. A community may continue to speak in familiar sounds, but each generation uses them less, trims them shorter, replaces them with words of another tongue. What once was the melody of daily life becomes reduced to fragments, to special moments, to private whispers. By the time scholars recognize that a language is vanishing, it is already too late, for it has ceased to live in the mouths of children. The story repeats across centuries and continents, always quiet, always slow. Consider the story of Cornish in the far southwest of Britain. For centuries, it was the language of daily life, of markets, homes, and prayers. But English crept steadily into schools, into trade, into law. Parents, wanting better prospects for their children, encouraged English in the household. Cornish did not disappear in a single moment. It simply shrank, until one day in the late 18th century, a woman's prayer was recorded as one of the last fluent expressions of the tongue. Yet even then, no one declared Cornish dead. Life continued, people conversed, fields were worked, families grew. Only later did historians realize that an entire language had slipped quietly into silence. Elsewhere, the same pattern unfolded. In the Americas, hundreds of indigenous languages once filled the forests and plains with rich and varied sound. But as colonial languages spread, many of those voices faded. Families blended speech at first, then abandoned old words for those of schools and churches. By the time scholars arrived to document them, countless languages had already disappeared, leaving only faint traces in place names and folklore. In Asia, too, great shifts occurred. Along the steppes, nomadic peoples carried languages shaped by wind and open sky. But as empires expanded and centralized tongues gained prestige, the older voices faded, preserved only in fragments of song and poetry. What makes this fading so subtle is the way it hides in daily necessity. A farmer teaching his child to trade at market uses the words that sellers understand. A mother telling a story replaces one word with another her child has heard at school. None of these choices feel like abandonment, yet they accumulate until the old tongue exists only as memory. Imagine a quiet village evening. An elder hums a lullaby in the old language, rocking a child to sleep. The melody drifts gently through the air, the words ancient, shaped by centuries of voices. The child listens but will not learn to repeat them, for tomorrow at school she will be taught another language, one considered more useful. The song is beautiful, but it will end with her dreams, carried no further. The family does not mourn, for life moves forward, but something fragile has been lost without recognition. This is how languages fade, not with the clamor of battle or decree, but with the soft, unnoticed choices of daily life, with words left unsaid, with songs no longer sung, with prayers whispered for the last time. In a tongue no one else understands, the fading of languages is often less about loss and more about quiet transformation, a gradual reshaping of the sounds people use to express themselves. When we listen across history, we find that words shift like rivers, never fixed in one channel, always moving with time. A language that seems eternal in one century may, a few centuries later, sound almost unrecognizable, even to the descendants of those who once spoke it. This is not because anyone chose to abandon it, but because change arrived little by little, in the form of borrowed phrases, shortened syllables, altered grammar, and the steady pressure of new tongues gaining influence. Think of Latin, the great language of Rome. No one declared it finished. Rather, soldiers, farmers, and merchants spoke it differently in every corner of the empire. Over generations, the Latin of Gaul softened into French, the Latin of Iberia reshaped into Spanish and Portuguese. The Latin of the Italian countryside evolved into Italian itself. To the speakers of each age, they were simply speaking as their parents had. But to scholars looking back, entire new languages had emerged while the old one had faded. This process was so seamless that people did not notice. It happened in markets, in kitchens, in lullabies, in sermons. It happened in the voices of mothers and children, in the jokes told at work, in the songs sung during festivals. Language is lived, not preserved, and because of that, it changes as life changes. And yet with each shift, something delicate is lost. A proverb that once captured wisdom in perfect rhythm may lose its meaning in translation. A song that once echoed across fields may sound awkward in a new tongue, and so is forgotten. A prayer whispered for centuries may no longer reach the same resonance when spoken with altered words. Languages do not only hold vocabulary, they hold memory, identity, and unique ways of viewing the world. When they fade, they take with them subtle colors of human experience. Consider also the case of smaller languages spoken by isolated communities. Many of these existed only in spoken form, without writing to preserve them. When a new dominant language entered through trade, conquest, or education, those smaller voices yielded almost silently. Parents, wishing to help their children succeed, often encouraged the use of the new tongue, thinking of opportunity rather than loss. Within 2 or 3 generations, the old language would survive only in fragments. A greeting here, a place name there, a half-remembered song sung by elders. To outside observers, it appeared as though the language had vanished. But to those living through it, nothing dramatic had occurred. Life had simply adjusted. Imagine such a household at twilight. A grandmother speaks a few lines in the old tongue as she stirs a pot over the fire. Her children answer her in the dominant language, polite but detached, while her grandchildren barely recognize the words at all. The grandmother does not scold them. She smiles, knowing they are speaking what is useful for their lives. She does not realize that with her, an entire language may end. The candle flickers on the table, shadows move across the walls, and the words of centuries slip quietly into silence. No mourning, no announcement. Only the soft erasure of time. This is how languages have always faded, not in noise, but in stillness, carried away by the ordinary flow of life. The fading of languages often followed paths shaped by power, not only the quiet choices of families, but also the broader movements of empire, trade, and religion. When a conquering people arrived, they brought with them a tongue of authority, the language of soldiers, officials, and taxes. Over time, this new language did not simply exist alongside the old. It began to replace it, slowly but surely, not through decree alone, but through practicality. A farmer who wished to sell in markets found it easier to bargain in the language of merchants. A child who wished to serve in an army or a court was required to learn the language of rulers. The old speech was not banned, but it was gently pushed aside by opportunity. This made its disappearance almost invisible, for people believed they were simply choosing what was useful. Consider the spread of Arabic after the 7th century. Across North Africa and the Middle East, dozens of local languages once thrived, some related, some entirely different. As Islam spread, so too did Arabic, the language of scripture and law. Local tongues did not vanish instantly, but across centuries they retreated. Families prayed in Arabic, wrote contracts in Arabic, and slowly spoke Arabic at home. The old languages lingered for generations, especially in villages, but eventually they faded until only fragments remained. The same happened with the spread of English, Spanish, and Portuguese in later centuries. Colonists brought not only their flags but their words, and the children of native communities grew up learning those words in schools, believing them to be keys to a wider world. Parents, often out of love, encouraged this, thinking it would help their children survive. And so, without battle or decree, old languages slipped quietly into the shadows. Scholars who trace these disappearances see the pattern repeated endlessly. First comes bilingualism, a blending of tongues. People mix words, borrow phrases, switch between languages depending on context. Then, over time, the dominant language pushes further in, becoming the norm for trade, law, and education. The old language becomes reserved for private spaces, for songs, for stories told by elders. Eventually, even those uses fade, until the language is spoken only by the oldest generation. And when they are gone, so too is the language, carried away without ceremony. Imagine a village evening during such a time. A grandfather speaks to his grandchildren in the old language, but they respond in the new, laughing, eager to practice what they learn in school. He smiles at them, proud of their confidence, yet he does not notice that his words are the last of their kind. Outside, neighbors call across the fields in the dominant tongue. The old language hangs in the air like a fading echo, beautiful but fragile, destined to disappear with him. No bells toll for its end. No chronicles record its last breath. Life continues, and the loss passes unnoticed. This is how countless languages have faded. Not in flames, but in whispers, surrendered not by defeat, but by forgetfulness, until what was once ordinary becomes a mystery for future scholars to reconstruct. The fading of languages can be understood not only through conquest and power, but also through the quiet pull of community and identity. People often adapt their words to fit in with neighbors, to be accepted, to feel part of something larger. This means that the death of a language is rarely resisted with anger. Instead, it is yielded to almost willingly, as people adopt new speech to match the world around them. A child who grows up surrounded by friends speaking the dominant tongue will naturally prefer that sound, finding the old words of grandparents heavy, old-fashioned, even embarrassing. Parents, wishing for their children to thrive, often encourage this, repeating that the new language is the key to respect and opportunity. And so the shift accelerates, quietly, invisibly, with no one calling it loss, only progress. Consider the example of Gaelic in Scotland. Once it was the dominant language across highlands and islands, rich with poetry and song. Yet, as English gained power through law, trade, and education, Gaelic became the tongue of the margins. Parents taught English to their children to secure futures in cities, while Gaelic was left for songs, prayers, and the conversations of elders. Slowly it shrank, until entire communities abandoned it, without realizing that they were closing the final chapter of a tradition thousands of years old. Yet at the time, it did not feel like abandonment. It felt like adaptation. Similar stories unfolded across the world. In the Pacific Islands, many local languages once thrived, each shaped by ocean winds and ancestral chants. When colonial powers brought their own tongues, schools enforced them, and children learned to speak differently. The old words remained in chants or ceremonies, but fewer people carried them into daily life. Within a few generations, the vibrant variety of voices diminished, leaving only a few elders with living memory of what once was. Scholars looking back saw loss, but families living through it saw necessity. What is most haunting about this process is how little awareness people had of it. A grandfather would speak in the old tongue, a grandson would answer in the new, and both would understand just enough to continue the conversation. Life went on, bread was baked, fields were tilled, stories were told. Yet beneath that surface of continuity, something irreversible was happening. The rhythm of thought itself, shaped by words, was changing. The metaphors that once gave color to life were slipping away, replaced by others. Imagine such a moment at dusk in a small home. An elder begins a tale in the old language, his voice deep and steady, but halfway through he pauses. Realizing the children are restless, their eyes glazed. He switches to the newer tongue, and suddenly their faces brighten, their attention sharpens. He sighs not with sorrow but with practicality, and continues. In that small moment, a centuries-old language takes another step towards silence. No one notices, because no one marks it as loss. This is how languages fade, through choices made not in rebellion or rejection, but in quiet adjustments, in the desire to belong, in the search for opportunity. They vanish not in noise but in whispers, leaving behind only fragments that future generations will wonder at, piecing together like broken pottery, trying to imagine the sound of voices that once filled the air as naturally as breath. The fading of languages is also tied to the way human beings measure value in the words they use. A language survives only when it is spoken by children, and children adopt only what they hear often, what they believe will serve them in life. When the language of power, trade, and school differs from the language of the home, a choice is made quietly in the minds of the young. They shift toward the words that open doors, leaving behind those that seem to close them. No decree is necessary, no force applied. The change flows as naturally as water down a hill. And thus, languages vanish not in violent endings, but in the soft current of preference. Imagine a small village where two tongues are spoken. The elders speak one, their words carrying memories of ancestors and traditions, while the younger people speak another, brighter, newer, more widely used. At meals, the family switches back and forth, blending the two without noticing. Over time, the balance tilts. Soon the old language appears only in greetings, in curses, in the names of hills and streams. Then even those fragments are replaced. Within 3 generations, the old tongue has nearly disappeared, remembered only by scholars or curious travelers who ask for words no one can provide anymore. This has happened in every corner of the world. In the Caribbean, the languages of indigenous peoples blended with European tongues and African dialects, creating creoles that carried traces of all but preserved none in full. In Central Asia, tribal languages gave way to the larger tongues of empires, spoken first in markets and then in homes. In South America, countless indigenous languages yielded to Spanish and Portuguese, their last speakers dwindling silently, their words surviving only in place names carved into maps. Yet even in loss there is continuity, for no language truly disappears without leaving marks. Each dominant tongue is layered with borrowings, idioms, and rhythms inherited from those it replaced. English, for example, carries Celtic traces, Norman French borrowings, Latin roots, and Germanic structure, each a reminder of languages that once flourished but faded into the background. In this way, the voices of the past linger invisibly in the present, woven into words we use without knowing their origin. What makes this process feel so haunting is its quietness. Unlike ruins of cities or the fall of kingdoms, The fading of languages leaves little spectacle. There is no dramatic collapse, only the silence of words no longer spoken. An elder may pass away, taking with him the last living memory of a song or a prayer, and no one outside the family notices. A lullaby that once carried comfort across generations ends in a whisper that no one records. The world goes on, and only centuries later do scholars realize that something has vanished. Picture such a scene at twilight. A grandmother sings in a language her own grandmother taught her. Her voice soft, the words strange to the ears of her grandchildren. They smile politely, but do not understand. To them the melody is lovely, but the meaning is lost. When she is gone, the song will vanish with her. No announcement will be made, no monument built. Only silence will remain, and the world will not know the moment it happened. This is how languages fade, without anyone noticing, without ceremony, without mourning, just the quiet, steady replacement of one set of sounds by another, until what was once common becomes a mystery written only in books and remembered no more on the tongues of living people. The fading of languages often leaves behind only faint traces, like footprints washed away by rain. A word survives in a river's name, a mountain's peak, or a village hidden in valleys. A phrase lingers in a proverb, its meaning half understood even by those who repeat it. Sometimes an old song remains, its melody intact, though its words are altered, reshaped to fit the rhythm of another tongue. These fragments are the fossils of speech, reminders that languages once lived fully, spoken by children in play, by lovers in whispers, by elders in blessings. Yet by the time scholars come to collect them, the voices that carried them are gone. No one notices the exact day when the last fluent speaker falls silent, because life continues as usual. A family buries their elder, a village celebrates a harvest, and only later do researchers realize that with that elder's passing, an entire worldview expressed in sound has ended. Consider how many languages faded during the expansion of great empires. When the Mongol Empire stretched across Asia, many smaller tongues of the steppes gave way to larger ones, not by decree, but by habit, as people adopted what connected them to trade and authority. When the Russian Empire expanded eastward, countless indigenous languages diminished, surviving only in isolated communities. In the Americas, waves of colonization spread Spanish, Portuguese, and English, leaving behind a trail of forgotten dialects, once vibrant with stories and traditions. None of these disappearances came with fanfare. Each was the result of choices so small they seemed invisible. A child answering in a different language at school, a parent encouraging the use of words that carried prestige, a song no longer sung because no one remembered all its verses. Each small choice accumulated until silence took hold. What makes this process both gentle and haunting is the way it is hidden within love and care. Parents who encourage their children to adopt a new language do so not to destroy the old, but to secure the child's future. They want their sons and daughters to find work, to gain respect, to belong to the wider world. They do not think of themselves as abandoning anything. They think of themselves as giving gifts. And yet, in this act of love, they quietly close the door on a language that had been spoken for centuries. Imagine sitting in a quiet home as dusk gathers. A mother scolds her child gently in the dominant tongue, though her own parents once would have used different words. She hums a lullaby in that new language, and the child drifts to sleep, never realizing there were older words for comfort. Outside, the wind stirs the fields, carrying no echo of the old speech. The house is warm, the family content, and yet history has ended in that small moment, unnoticed. Languages do not fall in flames, but dissolve in silence, carried away by the soft tide of daily life. By the time anyone recognizes their passing, they are already gone, and what remains are fragments, place names, borrowed words, scraps of verse. The living voice is no more. This is how languages fade, not with endings that draw attention, but with transitions so quiet they feel like continuity, until only centuries later does anyone look back and see what was lost. In the end, the story of languages fading without anyone noticing is less about endings and more about transformation. For even as words disappear, they leave behind echoes that shape the languages which follow. No tongue vanishes entirely without leaving traces, borrowed words woven into speech, rhythms carried in songs, patterns hidden in grammar. The old lives on within the new, invisible to most but detectable to those who listen carefully. Yet the living voice itself, the breath of daily speech, is what truly disappears, and that passing is almost always quiet. Picture a village centuries ago, where two generations sit together in the fading light. The elders speak slowly, their words rich with sounds that shape their lives. The younger ones answer in another tongue, confident, swift, and practical. The two groups understand each other only partly, but affection bridges the distance. For the elders, the old language feels eternal. For the young, it feels old-fashioned, something quaint to smile at but not to use. No one marks the moment as significant, yet in that exchange, a world passes away. By the time those children grow old themselves, the old words will be gone. Life will continue, new languages will rise, and no one will recall the exact moment of change. This is how hundreds, even thousands of languages have disappeared. They were not buried with monuments, nor mourned with ceremony. They simply faded into silence, carried away by daily choices, by the pull of usefulness, by the love of parents wishing their children to succeed. And in this way, history's great tapestry has been rewoven again and again, threads of speech disappearing while others are added, leaving patterns that shift with time. Scholars who study lost languages often speak of the sadness of this silence. They reconstruct fragments from songs, prayers, and inscriptions, trying to hear voices that no longer exist. Yet there is also beauty in the persistence of traces, in the way old words linger within new ones, in the way memory survives even when sound has gone. English carries whispers of Celtic and Norse, Spanish carries echoes of Arabic and Latin, and across the world, place names remind us of languages that once flourished in those landscapes. To listen closely is to hear the ghosts of speech still alive beneath our own. Imagine standing at twilight in a place where a language once lived. The air is calm, the fields quiet, and all that remains are names carved into maps. Rhythms buried in modern words. Songs remembered only in fragments. Yet if you close your eyes, you can almost hear the murmur of voices that once filled the air, as ordinary and unremarkable as breathing. They are gone, yet not entirely, for the world still carries the imprint of their sound. This is the paradox of language. It is fragile and fleeting, yet it endures in traces, shaping the way we think and speak even when we no longer recognize its presence. And so, as you let your eyes grow heavy and drift into sleep, remember that the fading of languages is not a tragedy marked by sudden silence, but a slow and gentle transformation, unnoticed by those who lived through it, yet profound in its effect on history. They faded without anyone noticing, yet their echoes remain, woven into the speech we use today, reminding us that nothing truly disappears. It only changes form, carried forward quietly in the endless murmur of human voices. And so, dear friends, our story has come to an end. Before we move on to the next journey, may I gently ask you to give this video a like and subscribe to the channel. Your support helps keep these quiet stories alive each night. Now, let us continue with another tale in our series of boring history for sleep: the lost gardens of the Renaissance. When we think of the Renaissance, our minds often turn to paintings glowing with vivid color, to sculptures carved with lifelike grace, to music echoing in cathedrals, and to scholars rediscovering the wisdom of antiquity. Yet there was another world of creation during this period, quieter and often overlooked, where beauty unfolded not in marble or canvas, but in soil, water, and stone. These were the gardens of the Renaissance, designed as reflections of order, knowledge, and harmony. They were places where human imagination and natural growth were woven together into living art, crafted to inspire contemplation and delight. Tonight, we begin with the story of those gardens, their rise, their splendor, and eventually their fading into silence, until many became lost to time. Imagine walking into one of these gardens at the height of its glory. The air is fragrant with herbs and flowers, arranged not at random, but in precise patterns. Pathways of gravel or brick lead the eye toward fountains that sparkle in sunlight, their streams carefully engineered to display both grace and ingenuity. Sculptures stand among the greenery, often figures from mythology, their marbles softened by vines curling at their feet. Walls of trimmed hedges form rooms of living architecture, where nobles might stroll, scholars might read, and poets might compose verses. These gardens were not only for pleasure, they were symbols of intellect and power. To create order in nature was to demonstrate mastery over it, and to arrange beauty in perfect symmetry was to mirror the harmony of the cosmos itself. The Renaissance garden was thus more than a retreat. It was a philosophy expressed in earth and water. Behind this beauty lay the influence of ancient Rome. Ruins of villas had revealed traces of gardens long forgotten, with their terraces, fountains, and statuary. Inspired, Renaissance patrons sought to recreate and surpass those ancient wonders. Wealthy families such as the Medici commissioned elaborate designs, hiring architects who treated the land as if it were a canvas. Water was directed through aqueducts, cascades, and hidden pipes, feeding fountains that astonished visitors with their precision. Plants were chosen not only for their fragrance and color, but also for their symbolic meaning. Rosemary spoke of memory, laurel of triumph, myrtle of love. To walk these gardens was to read a living text, one where every path and plant carried meaning. And yet, for all their grandeur, these gardens were fragile. They depended on wealth to sustain them, on labor to maintain their intricate shapes, and on political stability to keep them safe from neglect. As fortunes shifted, wars erupted, and tastes changed, many of these gardens withered. Some were abandoned, their fountains dry, their hedges growing wild, until they became indistinguishable from woodland. Others were redesigned in later centuries, their Renaissance order replaced by Baroque spectacle or romantic wilderness. Slowly, the original creations disappeared, remembered only in sketches and descriptions. Imagine now standing at twilight in one of these gardens. The paths are quiet, the fountains silent, the air heavy with the scent of overgrown flowers. Statues still stand but weathered, their faces softened by time. The symmetry is broken, yet in the silence there remains a trace of what once was, a harmony that lingers like music faintly remembered. These are the lost gardens of the Renaissance, places where human imagination once sought to join with nature in perfect form, now faded but never entirely gone. They live on in fragments, in ruins, in echoes carried through history, inviting us to pause, to breathe, and to remember that beauty, even when lost, continues to shape the way we see the world. To understand how Renaissance gardens came to embody such meaning, we must first look at the ideals that guided their creation. The Renaissance was an age that celebrated the rediscovery of classical learning, and this fascination with antiquity extended beyond philosophy, art, and literature into the very design of landscapes. In the writings of ancient authors such as Pliny the Younger, descriptions of Roman villas with their orderly terraces, shaded porticos, and carefully arranged groves provided inspiration. To Renaissance patrons, these texts were more than antiquarian curiosities. They were blueprints for how nature could be shaped into a reflection of human reason. The concept of symmetry played a central role. Just as painters constructed perspective with vanishing points, garden designers arranged paths, hedges, and fountains in patterns that drew the eye toward a central axis. This axial design became a hallmark of Renaissance gardens, symbolizing both intellectual clarity and control over space. Standing at the head of such a garden, a visitor could gaze down an avenue of trees that stretched in perfect alignment, reinforcing the sense that order itself had been planted into the earth. Water, too, was more than an ornament. Hydraulic engineers of the Renaissance revived and advanced techniques of channeling and pressure, creating fountains that delighted with their playfulness. Some sprayed water in delicate arcs that sparkled like crystal in the sun, while others were designed to surprise, sending sudden jets upon unsuspecting guests. Beneath the delight lay serious intention. Water represented both life and mastery, the ability to harness a force of nature for human enjoyment. Behind every stream was an unseen network of pipes, cisterns, and aqueducts that demonstrated the marriage of science and artistry. Plant life, though abundant, was chosen with equal care. Unlike the medieval gardens that emphasized utility, herbs for medicine, vegetables for sustenance, Renaissance gardens emphasized meaning. A citrus tree in bloom was not merely fragrant. It symbolized purity and abundance. The rose suggested beauty and transience, while evergreen trees suggested endurance through time. Flower beds were often laid out in geometric patterns, forming knots or arabesques, that mirrored the decorative motifs of Renaissance textiles and manuscripts. To walk through such a garden was to read a text of symbols, each plant and each arrangement whispering lessons of virtue, victory, or love. Socially, these gardens served as stages for performance. Nobles invited guests to stroll along the avenues, to pause by a statue of Apollo or Venus, to dine under vine-covered pergolas where music echoed softly. Diplomats were entertained in these settings, their eyes as much drawn to the artistry of the landscape as to the negotiations at hand. A garden was a mirror of its owner's mind. Its refinement was evidence of culture, its order a sign of good governance. Just as a library displayed the wealth of books, a garden displayed the wealth of cultivated nature. Yet these gardens were not only for display, they were also for meditation. Monks, scholars, and poets sought in them places of quiet reflection. Within enclosed hedges, one might sit in silence, listening to the water's steady flow, considering the harmony of creation, and finding parallels between the geometry of the garden and the geometry of the heavens. The Renaissance garden thus became both a theater of the social world and a sanctuary for the inner world. And still, for all their elegance, they carried within them the seeds of their decline. Their complexity required constant attention, hedges to be trimmed, fountains to be maintained, terraces to be repaired. The expense of such labor was immense, and only the wealthiest families could sustain it. Wars could disrupt supplies, droughts could silence fountains, and shifting tastes could render the once celebrated designs old-fashioned. By the late 17th century, new styles would emerge that favored grandeur and spectacle over harmony and proportion, leaving the Renaissance ideal to fade quietly into history. When we picture the lost gardens today, we see not only flowers and fountains, but a vision of a world that sought to place humanity and nature in balance. They remind us that beauty requires care, that harmony is fragile, and that even the most ordered of creations may slip back into the quiet embrace of time. As Renaissance ideals spread across Europe, so too did the garden become a canvas upon which these values were expressed. Italy, as the birthplace of the Renaissance, gave the first models, but soon France, Spain, and even distant England began to adapt the principles to their own landscapes and climates. Each region left its subtle mark upon the tradition, yet at the heart remained the same aspiration: to bring order, meaning, and beauty into the natural world. In Italy, particularly around Florence and Rome, the villas of noble families such as the Medici provided some of the most famous examples. Their gardens combined terraces that climbed hillsides with carefully framed vistas that looked toward distant horizons. Designers used the natural slopes of the land, not to fight against but to enhance their vision. A staircase bordered by statues might lead from one level to another, each level offering a new arrangement of fountains, groves, and flower beds. The visitor experienced the garden as a journey, each step unfolding a new perspective, until the summit provided a commanding view of the city or valley below. In France, where the climate was cooler and the landscape flatter, Renaissance gardens borrowed heavily from their Italian counterparts, but soon evolved toward greater expansiveness. French nobles adapted the geometric principles into broader parterres, where gravel paths outlined large symmetrical beds filled with flowers or clipped shrubs. Water channels became more elongated, forming reflecting pools that mirrored both the sky and the architecture of adjoining chateaux. These settings often became sites for elaborate court entertainments, from theatrical performances to fireworks, transforming the garden into a stage upon which the wealth and refinement of its owner could be displayed to a wide audience. Spain, with its legacy of Moorish design, blended Renaissance symmetry with Islamic traditions of enclosed courtyards and flowing water. The result was a distinctive hybrid in which tiled fountains, shaded arcades, and perfumed orange groves evoked both the classical past and the living memory of Al-Andalus. The Renaissance garden in Spain thus embodied a dialogue of cultures, revealing how traditions could merge to produce spaces of unique harmony. In England, the arrival of Renaissance influences was slower and more cautious. Medieval traditions of enclosed, practical gardens remained strong, yet by the late 16th century, noble estates began experimenting with more elaborate designs. Knotted flower beds, labyrinths of hedges, and decorative topiaries became fashionable. The English climate, wetter and less predictable, meant that certain Mediterranean plants could not thrive. but native species were incorporated with equal artistry. What emerged was a distinctly English interpretation of Renaissance order, where the geometry of design coexisted with the lushness of native greenery. Beyond Europe, travelers and diplomats carried stories of these gardens, and engravings spread their images across the continent. Books illustrated with diagrams of parterres, fountains, and terraces circulated among architects and scholars. The garden became not only a physical reality, but also a conceptual one, a symbol of human ability to shape the environment according to reason. In this way, even those who never walked in the Medici gardens or the parterres of France could imagine them, and in imagining, could share in their ideals. Yet, it was not only design that crossed borders. Plants themselves were exchanged, creating living threads that bound regions together. Citrus trees moved northward, tulips traveled westward, and exotic specimens from the newly encountered Americas began to find their way into European soil. To own such a plant was to demonstrate connection to the wider world, and gardens became living museums of global discovery. The Renaissance garden was thus a meeting place of cultures, climates, and ideas. But within this expansion also lay the beginnings of fragility. The more exotic the plants, the more effort required to keep them alive in unfamiliar soils. The more elaborate the fountains, the more maintenance demanded by their hidden systems. The more theatrical the entertainments, the more expensive the staging. What began as a vision of harmony increasingly required vast resources to sustain, resources that only the most powerful could afford. For a time, this did not matter. The Renaissance was also an age of ambition, of families and monarchs eager to prove their might through display. Yet in this reliance on wealth and display lay the seeds of vulnerability. As wars broke out, as economies strained, as political powers shifted, gardens often became neglected. Terraces once filled with fragrance grew over with weeds, fountains fell silent, and carefully trimmed hedges became wild. The harmony that had once reflected human mastery slipped gradually back into disorder, as though nature waited patiently for its return. Thus, even as the Renaissance garden spread across Europe, admired and emulated, its eventual decline was already written into the very demands that made it so enchanting. As the 16th century advanced, the Renaissance garden was increasingly tied to the ambitions of rulers who sought to project authority through grandeur and order. The garden became a mirror of political power as much as an expression of philosophical ideals. One could read the ambitions of a dynasty in the sweep of its terraces, the strength of its fountains, and the richness of its flora. In Italy, the Medici family continued to refine the art of garden making, using their estates as both retreats and instruments of influence. The gardens at the Villa d'Este, commissioned by Cardinal Ippolito d'Este, remain among the most famous, their fountains and cascades pushing the limits of hydraulic engineering. These displays of water did more than cool the air or please the eye. They symbolized control, suggesting that just as man could bend water to flow uphill or erupt in dazzling jets, so could he order society under his rule. The elaborate grottos, filled with statues and mechanisms that moved with water pressure, were marvels of ingenuity, but also demonstrations of wealth. Guests who walked these paths were not only entertained, but reminded of the cardinal's reach and intellect. In France, the growing centralization of the monarchy under the Valois and later Bourbon kings encouraged gardens of increasing scale. Though the great gardens of Versailles would come later, their seeds were planted in this period. Gardens at royal residences such as Fontainebleau demonstrated the expanding French taste for long axial views, where a central path or canal stretched toward the horizon. The visitor's eye was drawn outward, suggesting infinite reach, and by extension, infinite royal authority. Every trimmed hedge and leveled parterre whispered a political message. The king was the guarantor of order in a world that otherwise tended toward chaos. In Spain, the Renaissance garden found particular expression in the royal site of Aranjuez, where the Tagus River was coaxed into channels and pools that sustained both crops and ornament. Here again, the blending of utility and beauty recalled older traditions, yet the ambition was new. To shape a river into both provider and adornment was to declare sovereignty over nature itself, aligning the ruler's power with divine right. England, still under the influence of Tudor monarchs, approached the Renaissance garden with caution but increasing ambition. Elizabethan gardens displayed complex knotwork patterns, created from clipped herbs and flowers, which could be admired from above through the windows of great houses. These patterns were more than decoration. They symbolized knowledge and refinement, suggesting that the household which could sustain such intricacy was one deeply rooted in both culture and stability. The movement of people also shaped these gardens. Diplomats returning from Italy described what they had seen. Artisans carried techniques across borders, and engravings spread ideas with remarkable speed. The garden was not a local invention, but an international conversation, with each country adding its voice, sometimes harmonizing, sometimes diverging. In this way, the Renaissance garden became not a single style, but a family of related expressions, each tied to its soil and climate, but united by common principles of order, geometry, and symbolism. Yet while grandeur impressed, it also invited critique. Writers of the time sometimes lamented the excess, suggesting that too much artifice risked drowning the natural beauty that first inspired the garden ideal. They worried that in seeking to control every hedge and every fountain, patrons forgot that true harmony required balance, not domination. Even so, the great and wealthy pressed on, often competing with one another to outdo the last spectacle. Guests might be dazzled by music playing from hidden organs powered by water, or surprised by sudden sprays designed to wet their garments, playful reminders of the owner's mastery over both nature and human comfort. Such amusements were charming, but they revealed another truth. The Renaissance garden was never a simple retreat. It was a theater of power, where every path, statue, and fountain spoke silently of its patron's ambition. The symbolism ran deep. Water symbolized purity, but also control. Statues of mythological figures connected the present with the grandeur of antiquity, suggesting continuity between ancient Rome and contemporary rulers. Symmetry suggested balance and justice, while scale whispered of dominion. In these gardens, rulers could walk as if they too were gods, commanding beauty to unfold before them. But time reveals irony. The very scale that impressed contemporaries also made these gardens fragile. They depended upon a steady flow of wealth, constant labor, and political stability. Without these, fountains clogged, statues weathered, and symmetry gave way to disorder. Already in the late 16th century, the signs of fragility appeared. Wars of religion, economic downturns, and shifting political alliances drained treasuries and distracted rulers. In some cases, gardens were deliberately destroyed by enemies who knew that to dismantle a garden was to wound a ruler's prestige. Thus, as the Renaissance garden spread and flourished, it also carried within it the inevitability of decline, tied too closely to the fortunes of those who built them. As the Renaissance gardens matured into the later 16th and 17th centuries, they became increasingly elaborate, reflecting the complex interplay of art, science, philosophy, and politics that characterized the age. These gardens were not only collections of plants or spaces for leisure, but intellectual arenas where ideas were displayed as carefully as flowers. The patrons who commissioned them often sought to embody the Renaissance ideal of the uomo universale, the universal man, who combined knowledge of the natural world with mastery of the arts. Thus, the garden served as a living encyclopedia, a demonstration of human capacity to order and interpret nature. Terraces climbed slopes in measured steps, each level carefully designed to command a different view. Parterres spread out like woven carpets of greenery, their lines etched with gravel, their patterns only fully visible from above, reminding the visitor that the garden was a place of both participation and observation. Water played a central role, as engineers developed increasingly sophisticated methods to channel, raise, and direct it. Aqueducts carried streams from distant hills, and underground pipes fed fountains that astonished visitors with their precision and variety. Some fountains created gentle mists that cooled the air, while others erupted suddenly with mechanical figures that seemed to dance or fight. Water organs, ingenious instruments that converted hydraulic pressure into sound, filled grottos with music that seemed to emerge from the very earth. In these marvels, art and science joined hands, reflecting the Renaissance conviction that the natural world could be studied, understood, and harnessed. Symbolism deepened as well. Gardens frequently included statues drawn from classical mythology, reminding visitors of the link between ancient wisdom and modern rule. Hercules, Neptune, Venus, and Apollo appeared again and again, each figure chosen for what it implied about the patron. A ruler might align himself with Hercules to suggest strength, or with Apollo to suggest harmony and enlightenment. Visitors reading these symbols were expected to understand their meanings, and in doing so, they affirmed the cultural sophistication of both garden and patron. This interplay between display and interpretation made the garden a stage for subtle political messages, as well as personal enjoyment. Beyond symbolism, gardens also reflected the broader currents of exploration and trade. As European ships reached the Americas, Africa, and Asia, they returned not only with gold and spices, but with new plants that astonished gardeners. The orange, imported from Asia, became a status symbol across Europe. Wealthy patrons built orangeries, special glasshouses designed to protect these delicate trees from winter cold. The presence of such exotic fruits testified not only to horticultural skill, but to connections with global commerce. Similarly, tulips from the Ottoman Empire, maize from the Americas, and countless other species gradually altered the palette of European gardens. Each new plant was a token of discovery, a reminder that the world was widening and that those with the means to collect and cultivate such specimens were participants in that global expansion. Yet these gardens were not without critics. Some observers complained that in their pursuit of marvels, designers had abandoned simplicity, turning gardens into mechanical theaters rather than spaces of natural beauty. Others warned that the cost of maintaining such elaborate displays was unsustainable, draining resources that might be better spent elsewhere. Even so, the momentum carried on, and for a time the Renaissance garden represented the pinnacle of European cultural achievement, admired by diplomats, envied by rivals, and recorded in engravings that spread its fame. The experience of walking through such a garden must have been overwhelming. Imagine entering through a shaded avenue of cypress trees, emerging onto a terrace where water leapt from carved basins, and music played softly from hidden grottos. Statues of gods and heroes lined the paths, while perfumed air drifted from beds of roses, lilies, and lavender. Climbing higher, one might see the countryside spread out like a painted backdrop, with the geometry of the garden in the foreground emphasizing the contrast between cultivated order and untamed nature. At night, torches lit the fountains, and the play of firelight on water and stone created scenes that seemed half real, half dream. For guests, these gardens were more than diversions. They were lessons in philosophy, history, and power, all conveyed through the language of artifice. For owners, they were instruments of influence, places to impress allies, intimidate rivals, and embody ideals. Each clipped hedge, each controlled stream of water, whispered of a world where human will had triumphed over accident and disorder. It is in this light that the Renaissance garden can be understood not as a mere collection of beautiful spaces, but as an essential expression of the age itself, reflecting its ambitions, its achievements, and its contradictions. As the 16th century gave way to the 17th, the Renaissance gardens of Italy and France began to evolve even further, taking on dimensions that reflected not only aesthetic ambition, but also the shifting political landscapes of Europe. Gardens expanded in size and became extensions of palaces, forming a continuous dialogue between architecture and nature. No longer were they simply private retreats. They became instruments of spectacle, where rulers could stage their authority and demonstrate their mastery over both land and people. One of the clearest examples of this transformation can be seen in the Medici Gardens of Florence. What had begun as carefully designed spaces filled with classical references gradually grew into grand, almost theatrical landscapes that included terraces, cascades, grottos, and statuary designed to astonish. Visitors found themselves not merely walking in a pleasant environment, but moving through a sequence of orchestrated experiences. The visitors' senses were directed from one marvel to the next, and the garden itself became a narrative, telling a story of order, power, and human ingenuity. These experiences were heightened by the Renaissance fascination with hidden mechanisms. Engineers designed fountains that sprayed water when visitors stepped on concealed triggers, or sculptures that came to life with water pressure and clever joints. Guests might suddenly find themselves caught in an unexpected shower or startled by the sound of hydraulic organs echoing from the mouth of a grotto. Such surprises were not meant to be cruel, but playful, reminders that human invention could command nature in ways that bordered on the magical. To a courtier or foreign dignitary, these devices conveyed a subtle message. The prince who commanded such wonders could command men with equal ease. Beyond Italy, the influence of the Renaissance garden spread into France. where it took on new forms adapted to the local climate and political culture. The French nobility adopted the idea of terraces, fountains, and long avenues, but they also introduced greater emphasis on broad perspectives, aligning their gardens with the larger landscape. The chateaux of the Loire Valley became showcases of this style, blending the intimacy of enclosed spaces with sweeping views that extended into the horizon. These gardens not only delighted their owners, but also provided stages for the elaborate entertainments of the French court, where banquets, plays, and processions unfolded amid sculpted greenery. Meanwhile, the scientific dimension of gardens continued to develop. Botanical curiosity grew stronger as explorers brought back plants from Asia, Africa, and the Americas. Some Renaissance gardens included small experimental plots where these new species were cultivated, observed, and classified. This blending of display and study laid the groundwork for the great botanical gardens of the later 17th century, where horticulture became inseparable from scientific research. For the Renaissance mind, there was no contradiction between beauty and knowledge. Indeed, they were two faces of the same coin. To walk through a garden was not only to delight the eye, but to engage the intellect, to see in the arrangement of nature a mirror of cosmic order. Religion, too, played a role in this evolving vision. While many gardens emphasized classical mythology, others incorporated Christian symbolism, blending pagan and sacred imagery into a complex tapestry. Fountains depicting Neptune might stand beside chapels dedicated to saints, reminding visitors that divine order encompassed all traditions, ancient and modern. In some cases, gardens were used for religious contemplation, their quiet paths and shaded groves offering a place for prayer as well as pleasure. In others, they served as metaphors for paradise, earthly reflections of the heavenly garden that awaited the faithful. Yet despite their variety, what united these gardens was their sense of control and artifice. The natural world was never allowed to roam freely, but was shaped, trimmed, directed, and made to serve human intention. Even the grottos, designed to look like caves, were carefully constructed, their roughness artfully arranged to seem natural while concealing pipes and mechanisms. This tension between art and nature, between authenticity and illusion, lay at the heart of Renaissance garden design. The visitor might feel both awe at the spectacle and a subtle unease at the degree of manipulation involved. If the garden was beautiful, it was also a reminder of power, the power of wealth to summon labor, the power of knowledge to bend nature, the power of rulers to shape not only landscapes, but the experience of all who entered them. As the 17th century advanced, these themes would become even more pronounced, paving the way for the Baroque gardens that followed. But the Renaissance gardens held a special place as the moment when Europe rediscovered not just the forms of antiquity, but the idea that gardens could be total works of art, spaces where geometry, mythology, science, and politics converged. They were the quiet laboratories of culture, and although many of them have been lost, their influence lingers in every clipped hedge and every fountain that still rises in the formal parks of Europe. By the time Renaissance ideals in garden design began to ripple outward into the broader European world, the notion of the garden as a stage for power and intellect had already taken root in Italy and France. But the spread of these ideas did not mean simple imitation. Instead, each region adapted the Renaissance vision to its own traditions, climates, and cultural expectations. In England, for example, the Italian influence arrived more slowly, mediated by travelers who had seen the wonders of Florence or Rome and returned eager to bring some part of that splendor home. English estates in the 16th and early 17th centuries began to experiment with terraces, fountains, and the alignment of house and garden, but the results were often blended with the older medieval love of enclosed gardens, orchards, and practical kitchen plots. This merging created a uniquely English approach, one that valued both display and usefulness, and that balance would echo into later centuries when English gardens became famous in their own right. In the German-speaking lands, Renaissance gardens often reflected the tastes of princely courts, where fortresses on hilltops were gradually transformed into palatial residences with gardens sprawling down their slopes. Here, too, geometry reigned supreme, with intricate knot gardens, parterres, and waterworks that glittered in the sun. But beyond their beauty, these gardens carried another message, one of stability in a region often shaken by religious conflict and political fragmentation. To walk through such a garden was to be reminded that order could exist, even amid turbulence, that lines could be drawn straight even when the world seemed crooked. Meanwhile, in Spain and Portugal, Renaissance gardens encountered yet another set of influences, merging with the legacy of Islamic horticultural traditions inherited from centuries of Moorish presence. The Alhambra of Granada, with its courtyards, pools, and channels of flowing water, had long served as an inspiration, and Renaissance designers found ways to blend classical ideals with these older patterns. Spanish gardens of the Renaissance often emphasized water in abundance, not only as a symbol of life and power, but also as a way of cooling the air in hot climates. The whisper of fountains and the shimmer of pools lent a sense of tranquility that suited both religious meditation and aristocratic leisure. Across all of Europe, one common thread was the increasing role of the garden as a site of performance. Royal courts and noble houses staged elaborate festivals among the hedges and fountains, transforming gardens into temporary theaters where allegorical plays, masks, and processions unfolded. Costumes, music, and fireworks were combined with the sculpted greenery to create total spectacles that dazzled guests and reinforced the magnificence of the host. A visitor walking through the gardens might at any moment encounter actors dressed as gods, muses, or virtues, reciting verses that linked the glory of the estate to the glory of antiquity. The garden thus became not only a physical space, but also a medium for art in motion, a stage upon which myths were reenacted and political messages carefully wrapped in allegory. Yet amid these grand displays, there was also a quieter dimension, one that is sometimes forgotten. For many scholars, poets, and thinkers, gardens were places of retreat where the mind could wander as freely as the body. The neatly ordered paths and shaded bowers encouraged meditation, and Renaissance humanists often wrote of the inspiration they found in such settings. To sit by a fountain, book in hand, with the sound of trickling water nearby, was to experience a harmony of nature and intellect, a reminder that the pursuit of knowledge was itself a cultivation no less demanding than the pruning of a hedge. In this sense, gardens were not only mirrors of political power, but also reflections of the inner life. As the 17th century loomed, the balance between these two dimensions, the public spectacle and the private retreat, grew increasingly delicate. Some gardens tilted toward extravagance, piling marvel upon marvel in a race to outshine rivals, while others preserved a sense of intimacy and contemplation. But all bore the marks of the Renaissance spirit, that conviction that beauty, order, and knowledge were interconnected. The loss of many of these gardens over time, whether through neglect, war, or changing fashions, only deepens the fascination with them today. We read of their wonders in travelers' accounts, see faint traces in old engravings, and walk through the scattered ruins where terraces have crumbled and fountains run dry. The imagination must supply the rest. The gleam of marble, the murmur of water, the rustle of silks as courtiers strolled in the evening air. The lost gardens remind us that even the most carefully cultivated landscapes are subject to time, and that nature, once commanded, eventually reasserts itself. Yet for a few generations in the Renaissance, these gardens stood as visible dreams, woven from stone, water, and greenery, embodiments of a world that sought to marry the ancient and the modern, the natural and the artificial, the earthly and the divine. As the Renaissance matured and began to give way to the Baroque, the gardens of Europe reflected not only aesthetic preferences, but also profound changes in philosophy, science, and society. The earlier Renaissance ideals of proportion, harmony, and measured elegance did not disappear, but they became infused with new ambitions. And nowhere was this clearer than in the way gardens grew larger, more elaborate, and more directly tied to displays of absolute authority. In Italy, where the movement had first taken root, many Renaissance gardens remained influential long after their prime, serving as blueprints for later designers. The villas around Rome, Florence, and Tivoli still drew visitors who marveled at their terraces, statues, and waterworks. Yet by the 17th century, another trend began to overshadow them: the rise of centralized monarchies, especially in France, where kings sought to transform gardens into symbols of their almost divine status. The French interpretation of Renaissance gardening took the Italian foundation and expanded it with unmatched scale and precision. Architects and gardeners under the patronage of kings such as Louis XIV crafted landscapes that stretched as far as the eye could see, where every tree was placed with intent, every fountain carefully aligned, and every avenue pointed toward the royal palace. Versailles became the pinnacle of this vision, but its origins lay firmly in Renaissance thought, in the conviction that humanity could impose order upon the natural world, and that a garden could serve as a visible metaphor for power. Yet while grandeur dominated, Renaissance gardens also had a more fragile side, one that remained visible in private estates, monastic cloisters, and even small-town courtyards. These lesser-known spaces echoed the larger gardens, but with a quieter tone, more suitable for reflection than spectacle. They might include a modest parterre, a central fountain, or a pergola overgrown with vines, where one could sit and find shade during the heat of summer. For the ordinary visitor, these gardens carried their own kind of power, not the authority of kings, but the comfort of order and beauty in a world often uncertain. They remind us that the Renaissance spirit was not only about dominance, but also about harmony, not only about display, but also about peace of mind. Across Europe, the legacy of the Renaissance garden also became visible in the way science and horticulture intertwined. Botanical gardens, for instance, emerged as a distinct institution in the 16th century, particularly in Italian university towns such as Padua and Pisa. These gardens were not built to entertain or to impress nobles, but to cultivate and classify plants, many brought from distant lands by explorers and traders. In them, we see the Renaissance thirst for knowledge made literal in the soil. Plants from the Americas, Africa, and Asia found their way into these living collections, and scholars carefully recorded their properties, uses, and appearances. The orderly arrangement of plants by category mirrored the geometric layouts of aristocratic gardens, another sign of the deep connection between human intellect and natural order. It is easy to imagine a scholar walking along those carefully labeled beds, notebook in hand, pondering the medicinal uses of a new herb, or marveling at the shape of an exotic flower that had crossed oceans to reach Europe. These academic gardens may have lacked the theatrical fountains and gilded statues of royal estates, but they carried their own drama, the drama of discovery and the slow unfolding of the world's diversity through careful observation. Meanwhile, the influence of Renaissance gardening began to ripple far beyond Europe itself. Spanish and Portuguese colonies carried elements of these designs overseas, blending them with local traditions and climates. In the New World, for example, courtyards and gardens attached to monasteries and administrative centers often reflected Renaissance ideals, with symmetrical layouts and central fountains, while also incorporating native plants and irrigation techniques. These transplants created hybrid landscapes, part European, part indigenous, that spoke of the complex cultural exchanges of the age. The fact that Renaissance gardens traveled in this way reminds us that they were more than local fashions. They were symbols of a worldview, one that believed in the universality of order, symmetry, and cultivated beauty. Yet even as these ideals spread, they also began to change, slowly dissolving into new forms. By the late 17th century, the theatrical excesses of the Baroque, and later the romantic irregularities of the 18th century, began to eclipse the earlier Renaissance style. Straight lines gave way to winding paths, marble statues were softened by groves of trees, and fountains, once symbols of command, became features meant to charm or delight. The Renaissance garden was not destroyed, but it faded into memory, remembered in engravings, in travelers' accounts, and in fragments of terraces and walls that still survive today. In those fragments, we can still sense the old ambition, the desire to capture beauty in geometric lines, to make nature an ally in the expression of intellect and art, and to turn the simple act of walking outdoors into an encounter with meaning. When we think of lost gardens today, we imagine ruins overgrown with weeds, stones cracked by centuries of weather, and fountains that no longer flow. But in the Renaissance, they were alive with voices, with the sound of footsteps on gravel, with the rustle of silk gowns, with the notes of music drifting through the air during evening festivities. To remember them is to remember not just their design, but the people who walked them, the hopes they embodied, and the fleeting brilliance of a culture that sought to leave its mark upon both time and nature. As the Renaissance gardens faded into memory, their legacy remained imprinted on the landscapes of Europe in ways both subtle and profound. Even when fashions shifted toward the dramatic flourishes of the Baroque, or the romantic irregularities of later centuries, the foundations laid in the 15th and 16th centuries continued to guide the imagination of designers, scholars, and patrons. The idea that a garden could reflect not just wealth but knowledge, not just beauty but philosophy, lingered quietly in the background. It is this persistence that makes the story of Renaissance gardens so intriguing, for while many of their most famous examples eventually declined, their influence lived on in the ideals of order, symmetry, and learned beauty. Consider the way Renaissance gardens shaped the education of nobles and scholars alike. For many aristocratic families, gardens served as classrooms under the open sky, places where children were introduced to geometry through the careful study of parterres, to mythology through statues of gods and heroes, and to natural science through the tending of herbs and rare plants. To walk through a Renaissance garden was, in some sense, to walk through a textbook of humanist thought, each pathway and feature designed not only to please the senses, but to train the mind. Even centuries later, when new styles had overtaken the old, these gardens were remembered as places where learning and leisure intertwined seamlessly, where one might recite poetry beside a fountain, or reflect on moral lessons in the shade of a clipped hedge. Yet their survival was uneven. Some gardens remained intact, preserved by families who cherished tradition, while others crumbled as fortunes declined. Wars swept across Europe, or new owners imposed different tastes. Fires, floods, and neglect all played their part in erasing once grand landscapes. It is striking to think of how many Renaissance gardens disappeared entirely, leaving behind only a fragment of wall, a broken statue, or a name recorded in an archive. These lost gardens remind us that beauty, no matter how carefully crafted, is often fragile, dependent on constant maintenance and on the will of those who inherit it. Their loss is part of what gives them their melancholy charm, for we imagine what once was, even as we see only traces. Travelers of the 17th and 18th centuries often remarked on these ruins. They wrote of terraces overrun with weeds, fountains clogged with debris, and sculptures cracked by frost. Yet even in decay, such places retained a strange allure. The straight lines and faded mosaics spoke of an earlier vision, of a time when order and harmony seemed possible in the arrangement of stones and plants. In this sense, Renaissance gardens anticipated the very romanticism that would later replace them, for their ruins invited contemplation, nostalgia, and the bittersweet pleasure of remembering what had passed. At the same time, the Renaissance approach to gardens influenced broader aspects of European culture, even when its direct style fell from favor. Botanical gardens, established in Padua, Pisa, and elsewhere, inspired similar institutions across the continent, creating a tradition of scientific study that endures to this day. The practice of categorizing plants, arranging them according to their properties, and recording their characteristics had its roots in the Renaissance passion for order and symmetry. Similarly, the very idea of the garden as a place of conversation, reflection, and measured beauty persisted into later centuries, even when the designs themselves shifted toward wilder or more theatrical forms. Beyond Europe, the legacy of Renaissance gardens could be traced in colonial landscapes, in missionary courtyards, and in hybrid spaces where European geometry met indigenous traditions. Though the results varied, they all carried a common thread: the conviction that nature could be shaped, arranged, and given meaning by human hands. The gardens of the Renaissance were not mere decorations, but expressions of a worldview that saw the natural world as a canvas for intellectual and artistic ambition. To this day, when we visit the remnants of these gardens, whether in Italy, France, or Spain, we sense this ambition lingering like a faint echo. A ruined staircase leading nowhere, a dry fountain surrounded by silent trees, a statue whose features have eroded with time, all whisper of the once living dialogue between nature and humanity. We may never fully recover what these gardens were, but by piecing together descriptions, drawings, and archaeological remains, we catch glimpses of their spirit. And in that spirit we see the Renaissance itself, bold, confident, striving to impose harmony on a complex world, and yet vulnerable to the passage of time. The lost gardens are not merely relics of design, they are symbols of impermanence, reminders that even the most careful order must eventually yield. They teach us gently that beauty is fleeting, that human ambition, no matter how grand, is always tempered by the quiet persistence of nature. It is in this lesson that their legacy endures, more profound than their fountains, more lasting than their terraces, living on not in stone or plant, but in the imagination of those who dream of them. As we reach the conclusion of this exploration of the lost gardens of the Renaissance, it is worth pausing to reflect on what they represented, not only to the people of their time, but also to us who look back centuries later. These gardens were never simply about flowers, hedges, or fountains. They were carefully constructed worlds where human imagination sought to frame nature according to ideals of harmony, knowledge, and controlled beauty. They mirrored the optimism of the Renaissance, an age that believed in the power of reason and art to bring order to chaos, to transform even the wilderness into a stage for learning and contemplation. Each pathway, terrace, and statue was deliberate, each aligned axis and proportioned parterre, a silent statement of confidence in the human ability to design meaning into the natural world. To step into such a garden was to step into a living philosophy, where nature and culture intertwined so seamlessly that the boundaries blurred. Visitors would not only admire the geometry of hedges or the sparkle of fountains, but also sense themselves as part of a greater pattern, a harmony stretching from the order of plants to the movements of the stars. And yet, as we have seen, time has a way of dismantling even the most carefully maintained designs. Seasons eroded edges, wars toppled statues, neglect allowed roots to break through marble steps. What was once crisp and ordered became tangled, overgrown, or lost altogether. In this slow unraveling, the Renaissance gardens became something else entirely, reminders of impermanence. They spoke, and still speak, of how fragile human ambition is when placed against the endless patience of nature. The very symmetry that once embodied confidence eventually became the backdrop for ruin, vines, and moss reclaiming what had been imposed upon them. In this transformation, however, lies a deeper beauty, for the Renaissance gardens, even in their decay, remind us that human creativity leaves traces that cannot be entirely erased. The broken fountain still whispers of the ingenuity that once made water leap into the air. The cracked statues still suggest the hand of an artist who sought to capture the eternal. And though the gardens as complete entities are gone, their memory continues to inspire, influencing landscape design, art, and even the way we imagine paradise itself. Today, scholars piece together plans, artists attempt reconstructions, and travelers wander through sites where fragments of walls and faded mosaics hint at what once was. We know these gardens not only through what remains, but also through what has been written about them, through the words of visitors who marveled at their grandeur or lamented their ruin. It is in these testimonies that the lost gardens live on, preserved in the imagination long after the plants have withered and the fountains have dried. The lesson of the lost gardens is gentle but enduring. That beauty exists not only in perfection, but also in memory, not only in the order we impose, but also in the inevitable return of disorder. They teach us that creation and loss are intertwined, that every act of cultivation carries within it the seed of eventual decline. And yet this does not make the act less meaningful. On the contrary, it deepens its value, for it shows that even temporary expressions of harmony can echo far beyond their lifespan, touching minds and hearts centuries later. As we let these thoughts settle, imagine yourself walking slowly along a deserted path where tall grass now grows between once perfect stones. The air is quiet, only the faint sound of wind moving through leaves. You pause beside a fountain, long dry, its basin cracked but still holding the shape of what it once was. You trace the outline with your eyes, and for a moment see water springing up again, sparkling in the sun, reflecting a world of order and beauty. Then the vision fades, leaving only the silence of the present. But within that silence is a calm acceptance that all things pass, and that in their passing they gain a different kind of permanence. The Renaissance gardens are lost, but in speaking of them, in imagining them, in remembering the ideals they embodied, we keep them alive in another form, one that no storm, no war, no neglect can erase. And so, though we cannot walk their paths as they once were, we can still wander them in thought, finding peace in the knowledge that beauty, even when fleeting, always leaves something behind. That brings us to the end of the previous story. Before we move on, may I kindly ask you to give this video a like and subscribe to the channel It truly helps us continue bringing you these quiet journeys into the past. And now, let us continue with the next story in our series of Boring History for Sleep, as we arrive at the disappearance of ancient roads. When we think of roads today, we imagine wide ribbons of asphalt stretching across landscapes, filled with cars and lined with signs, lights, and fences. Yet the idea of a road is far older than the modern age, and has always been more than just a strip of ground made firm for travel. Roads are symbols of connection, arteries through which people, goods, and ideas flow, and in antiquity they were the backbone of entire civilizations. To walk along an ancient road was to step into the very lifeline of a kingdom or empire, to feel beneath your feet the compacted soil, the stones carefully placed, or the paving slabs worn smooth by countless journeys. In many cases, these roads outlived the rulers who ordered them built. But curiously, some of them did not survive at all. They vanished slowly, absorbed into fields, covered by forests, reclaimed by rivers, or dismantled for the stone that made them. The disappearance of ancient roads is a quiet story, one that lacks dramatic battles or grand monuments, yet it tells us something about how fragile human achievements can be, and how even the most solid paths can fade when societies shift. The earliest roads that archaeologists trace were not paved in stone, but marked paths created by repeated footsteps or the dragging of sledges. In places like Mesopotamia, narrow tracks linked small villages to irrigation canals and markets. These paths were not meant to last forever, but their importance was immense, guiding traders who carried grain, clay tablets, and woven goods. Later, in Egypt, the deserts offered natural corridors where caravans crossed, and the marks of wheels and animals etched themselves into the ground. But unless renewed, such marks disappeared under sandstorms, and the desert hid them within days. Even in the lands of the great empires, roads were vulnerable. The Roman Empire, famous for its network of roads stretching thousands of miles, faced this reality. Roman engineers laid thick foundations, stone paving, and drainage systems that were marvels of durability. Yet after the fall of the empire, many of those roads vanished, not through erosion alone, but through human neglect. A road, after all, needs travelers. When trade routes shifted or cities declined, a paved road could suddenly lose its purpose. We can picture it, a stretch once alive with soldiers marching in formation, or carts loaded with olive oil and wine, falling silent, grass pushing through cracks, villagers prying up stones to use for their walls or churches. Within a few generations, a proud Roman road might become nothing more than a faint ridge in a meadow. The disappearance of roads also reflects the vulnerability of memory. If a community no longer recalls where a road once led, the path itself becomes less useful. Ancient maps were rare and often symbolic. So much of road knowledge was oral, passed down from guide to guide. A broken chain of memory could render a road forgotten even if its surface remained. This is why archaeologists sometimes find stretches of paved stone in forests or farmland. Roads that once carried legions, but were abandoned and lost to the living memory of local people. What makes this story interesting is how the disappearance was usually gradual, not sudden. Unlike a city that could burn in a day or a temple toppled by an earthquake, a road usually faded piece by piece. A bridge might collapse in one century, diverting travelers to another route. A town at a junction might decline, reducing traffic. A flood might cover a section with silt. Then plants spread, animals trampled the edges, farmers plowed through the stones, and within 2 or 3 centuries, the once vital line connecting regions was erased. And yet, in some landscapes, faint traces remain. In Northern Europe, Roman roads can be detected as straight lines visible from the air, cutting through forests in ways that nature rarely does. In Central Asia, the Silk Road is not a single path, but a shifting web of tracks across deserts and mountains, many of which are now invisible to the eye, yet can still be sensed by the slight ridges or the alignment of ruins. What all of this suggests is that roads, despite seeming so permanent, are only as enduring as the societies that maintain them. Without continuous use and care, they vanish into the earth, leaving archaeologists to puzzle over fragments. The first part of our story, then, is to imagine the slow fading, a world where connections weaken, where paths that once defined empires grow over with weeds, and where travelers no longer know the way because the road itself has disappeared beneath their feet. The story of vanishing roads can be followed across continents, for each region built them in its own way. and each region also watched them fade away in silence. In the Andes, long before Europeans arrived, the Inca constructed a massive network of roads that stretched across mountains, valleys, and deserts, a system so vast that it linked lands thousands of kilometers apart. These roads were not paved with stone in every place, but often made by compacting earth and marking the way with walls or posts. Some sections were built with remarkable stonework, fitting blocks so tightly that even centuries of rain and earthquakes could not break them apart. Yet after the Spanish conquest, the system lost its unity. The empire that had maintained relay stations, runners, and storehouses was gone. Without the structure of officials and laborers to care for it, many roads slipped back into the landscape. Some bridges rotted away, and paths across high plateaus were swallowed by grasses. What remained became fragments, used by villagers or herders, but the sense of one continuous network dissolved. In Asia, the story was similar but more complex. The Silk Road was not one road, but countless overlapping tracks that carried silk, spices, and knowledge across deserts and mountains. Caravans relied on wells, oases, and trading posts. When one post failed, travelers shifted to another track, leaving behind a route that quickly vanished under shifting sands or grass. Even major empires like the Tang or the Mongol Khans depended on constant patrols and stations to keep the route safe. Once those supports weakened, the roads themselves were not permanent lines, but fragile trails that disappeared almost as soon as they were forgotten. If one walks in the deserts of Central Asia today, it is almost impossible to know where caravans once passed, except for the faint ruins of watchtowers or half-buried pottery. In Europe, the Middle Ages tell another version of the story. After Rome fell, many of its roads remained visible, but as kingdoms fractured and local power replaced central control, the will to maintain them weakened. Some roads were still used by pilgrims and traders, but others became unsafe, blocked by bandits or overgrown by woods. Medieval travelers often complained that Roman roads were broken and muddy, no longer reliable. Over time, some routes shifted to follow rivers, since waterways were safer and faster. Thus, entire stretches of paved Roman stone were abandoned. Villages dismantled them to reuse the stones for building walls, churches, and mills. What once had been the arteries of empire became quarries for local needs. The disappearance of roads also came from nature's quiet persistence. In wetlands, old causeways sank into mud. In mountains, landslides buried tracks. In forests, tree roots pried apart paving stones, moss covered the remains, and within a lifetime the road was nearly invisible. The human memory of where it ran was often the last thing to fade. Old folk tales sometimes mention a path to a ruined town, or a road used by ancestors, but when archaeologists search, they find only scattered stones. It is striking how roads require not only engineering, but culture to survive. A bridge of stone may last for centuries, but without the habit of people walking across it, even the strongest road fades into obscurity. When societies collapsed, their roads were among the first things to vanish, for they required no grand destruction. Silence alone was enough. Imagine a paved track once filled with wheels and hooves, left unused for 20 years. Grass would grow in cracks, rain would erode the edges, a farmer might plow through the line, and a shepherd might lead animals over it until the surface was indistinguishable from the field. By the time a century had passed, the road might remain only as a raised strip faintly visible after rain. In many places, satellite images today reveal these ghost roads, invisible from the ground, but showing up as straight lines in crops or soil. This disappearance reminds us of how fragile human effort is. Yet it also shows how deeply landscapes remember. Even when erased, a road can leave a scar that tells us people once connected here, that a civilization once tied its life to this corridor. Part 2 of the story, then, teaches us that the vanishing of roads was not a failure of engineering, but a result of changing priorities. Civilizations shifted trade to rivers or seas. Empires collapsed, memory faltered, and nature reclaimed. The road did not fall in a day, but slipped gradually into silence, until only careful eyes could detect it. When we turn our attention to the lands of the Middle East and North Africa, the story of disappearing roads becomes even more fascinating. For here the roads were not only channels of trade, but also lifelines of faith, conquest, and pilgrimage. Across the vast deserts of Arabia and the sweeping landscapes of the Levant, ancient paths once carried caravans heavy with incense, spices, and gold. These routes stitched together empires, linking the Red Sea to Mesopotamia and the Mediterranean to the Indian Ocean. Yet so many of them have vanished almost entirely, leaving only faint trails in the sands and a few forgotten place names on old maps. The Nabateans, for instance, were master traders whose capital at Petra thrived because of their ability to control caravan routes. They carved channels into rock, built cisterns, and created a system of hidden water supplies that allowed caravans to cross some of the harshest deserts in the world. But when the Romans absorbed their kingdom and new sea routes gained prominence, those desert roads slowly emptied. Without caravans passing through, cisterns dried up, sand drifted across the paths, and Petra itself declined. Today, travelers marvel at its rock-carved facades, but the web of roads that once led there has mostly dissolved into desert silence. In North Africa, the Roman Empire also left behind a network of roads, linking coastal cities like Carthage to inland settlements and across to the edge of the Sahara. These roads were built with impressive engineering, using stone pavements and mile markers, and for a time they supported both military campaigns and trade in grain, oil, and minerals. Yet as the empire withdrew and later Islamic caliphates rose, priorities shifted. Trade began to follow caravan routes that crossed deeper into the Sahara, linking sub-Saharan Africa to the Mediterranean through new hubs such as Timbuktu. The old Roman roads, no longer maintained, were slowly broken apart by shifting sands and local reuse of materials. A road that once saw legions march in tight formation became nothing more than a faint ridge that a shepherd might cross without realizing its history. In Mesopotamia, one of the oldest cradles of civilization, the story is even older. Paths that connected Sumerian city-states, later expanded under the Assyrians and Persians, were once maintained with extraordinary care. The royal road of the Achaemenids stretched from Sardis in Asia Minor all the way to Susa in Persia, a route of thousands of kilometers with stations for fresh horses, allowing messengers to cross the empire at remarkable speed. Herodotus himself marveled at it. But when empires collapsed, when borders shifted, and when new powers turned their attention to rivers or maritime trade, the royal road fell into neglect. Parts of it survived as local tracks, but the unity of the grand system was lost. Today only fragments remain, buried under villages, farmland, or highways built in modern times. Religion too played a role in preserving or erasing roads. Pilgrimage routes to Mecca, for example, were carefully maintained, and many survived for centuries because of their spiritual importance. Yet even here, the precise paths shifted over time, depending on political stability, availability of water, and safety from raiders. Old routes, once blessed with thousands of feet, could be abandoned when a new, safer, or more direct track was established. And in the desert, a road abandoned is a road forgotten. Within a decade, wind can erase almost every visible trace. The silence of the dunes covers human effort more efficiently than forests or swamps. Even camels in caravans leave little more than temporary impressions, gone within days. Thus, the Middle East and North Africa show us the most extreme example of how fragile roads can be. Unlike the monumental ruins of temples or forts, a road leaves little behind once neglected. Yet archaeologists with satellites and aerial photography have discovered faint scars beneath the sands, long straight lines that reveal the ghost of a forgotten route. These traces remind us that entire civilizations once pulsed along these corridors. They remind us that cities thrived because of these connections and withered when the roads were lost. The story of these vanished roads is not only about transport, but about how empires rise and fall. Roads are arteries, and when blood no longer flows through them, the body of empire weakens. The disappearance of these ancient roads tells us that power itself is fragile, tied not only to armies and rulers, but to the humble act of walking, riding, or driving along a path. Without people, without constant use, even the mightiest road can vanish into dust and silence. When we look eastward toward South Asia and Southeast Asia, the story of disappearing ancient roads takes on a different form, shaped not by deserts and dust, but by monsoons, dense forests, and shifting kingdoms. The Indian subcontinent has always been a land of trade and movement, from the Indus Valley to the Mauryan Empire, yet the traces of many ancient routes have vanished beneath fields, villages, and jungles. The Mauryan king Ashoka in the 3rd century BCE is said to have built a grand network of roads to unify his vast empire, placing shade trees along them, wells for water, and rest houses for travelers. These roads carried merchants, monks, and officials across regions that stretched from present-day Afghanistan to Bengal. Yet with the decline of the Mauryan state, maintenance collapsed, and much of the system broke apart. Later dynasties repaired some stretches, but others disappeared entirely. In the humid climate, where vegetation grows quickly and rains wash away the surface, an untraveled road is swallowed by nature within a season. Perhaps the most famous road of the region is the Grand Trunk Road, whose origins go back to antiquity, connecting the northwest passes with Bengal. While portions of it still survive and have been continuously rebuilt, many of its older branches, feeder roads, and side paths leading to forgotten towns and monasteries have vanished. Buddhist pilgrim routes to stupas and monasteries that once drew crowds of devotees fell into disuse when Buddhism declined in India. Pilgrims ceased to walk them, and the jungle reclaimed them. What was once a well-trodden road leading to a shrine may today be nothing more than a faint ridge in the earth or a hidden path locals barely recognize. In Southeast Asia, the story is even more dramatic. The Khmer Empire, centered at Angkor, built an extraordinary system of roads that connected its capital to distant provinces and to its great neighbors. Archaeologists have discovered straight embankments that stretched for hundreds of kilometers, lined with rest houses and temples, supported by an elaborate hydraulic system of canals and reservoirs. These roads were not just practical, but symbolic, demonstrating the reach of the king's power across Cambodia, Laos, and Thailand. Yet after the 15th century, when Angkor declined, many of these roads were abandoned. The jungle of Cambodia is relentless. Within decades, trees cracked the stone, roots tore through embankments, and seasonal floods eroded surfaces. A causeway that once supported elephants and carts could vanish beneath vines, leaving only a faint shadow detectable today with aerial scanning technology. In Burma and Thailand, roads once linked temple complexes and royal capitals, but shifting centers of power meant that entire regions could be abandoned. A city that thrived as a capital for a century might be left behind when kings moved elsewhere, and with it the roads lost their purpose. In the wet tropics, unlike the desert, there is no dry preservation. Instead, life consumes everything. Roads vanish into rice paddies or disappear under bamboo groves. Traces survive only in oral tradition, in village names hinting at past way stations, or in the alignment of modern paths that unknowingly follow ancient footsteps. Maritime trade also changed the fate of these roads. As sea routes grew more reliable and profitable, carrying spices, silk, and ceramics across the Indian Ocean, many inland roads lost their importance. Why trek through dense forest or risk monsoon-swollen rivers when ships could carry goods more quickly and in greater volume? Thus, once vibrant inland roads dwindled. Towns that had depended on caravan traffic declined, temples that had prospered from pilgrims became isolated, and roads themselves dissolved into earth and water. In some places, roads that connected to ancient ports are gone because the ports themselves shifted. In delta regions like Bengal or along the Mekong, rivers constantly change their courses. A road leading to a bustling dock could find itself leading to an empty swamp within a century. Villages relocated, traders adapted, but the old path remained unused until it was completely erased. The disappearance of roads in South and Southeast Asia reminds us that nature is not passive. It is an active force reclaiming human efforts. Unlike in arid climates where tracks can last millennia, here the balance favors forgetting. Only through archaeology, satellite imagery, and patient research can we reconstruct these networks. Yet even in their absence, they shaped history. The spread of Buddhism across Asia, the expansion of Hindu kingdoms, the rise and fall of empires, all depended on these roads. Their disappearance does not diminish their importance. It only deepens the mystery of how fragile human achievement can be when left to time, rain, and jungle. Turning our attention now to East Asia, the story of ancient roads takes on a scale and complexity shaped by vast landscapes, powerful dynasties, and the ebb and flow of political unity. China, more than any other civilization, invested heavily in roads as instruments of control, communication, and culture. Yet even here, many of the once vital arteries of empire have disappeared. leaving behind fragments of stone paving, faint ridges in fields, or little more than references in old texts. The Qin dynasty in the 3rd century BCE, under the rule of the first emperor Qin Shi Huang, famously ordered the construction of a unified road system to bind together his newly conquered territories. Chroniclers speak of roads radiating out from the capital like the spokes of a wheel, wide enough to allow multiple chariots to pass, with central raised sections for official use. These roads were both practical and symbolic, demonstrating imperial authority stretching across mountains, plains, and deserts. Yet many of these early roads were not built to last beyond the dynasty that conceived them. When the Qin fell, sections were neglected, and nature reclaimed them. In mountainous areas, landslides erased cuttings, while in river valleys, floods swept away causeways. What remains today is fragmentary, often discovered only when archaeologists stumble upon stretches of compacted earth beneath layers of later settlement. During the Han Dynasty, roads expanded further, linking the imperial capital to far-flung garrisons and markets. The Silk Road, so famous in later imagination, was not a single road, but a network of many paths, some broad, some little more than trails. While the main trunk routes between oases and passes are remembered, countless smaller roads branching into rural provinces, leading to once thriving market towns or military outposts, are now forgotten. Their disappearance is due in part to geography. China's rivers often change course, and agricultural expansion over centuries plowed up old roadbeds. A village path that once carried caravans may now be indistinguishable from farm tracks, its historic role invisible to the eye. The Tang Dynasty, often celebrated as a golden age, also invested in roads, especially to support postal stations that allowed rapid communication across the empire. Officials traveling with government orders relied on an intricate network of stations, each a day's journey apart, where horses could be exchanged and supplies obtained. Yet with the fall of the Tang and the fragmentation of the realm, many of these stations fell silent, and the roads leading to them were abandoned. In forested or fertile regions, abandonment quickly meant disappearance, as farmers converted land into fields or new towns rose elsewhere. In contrast, desert tracts survived longer, but even there, shifting sands buried them over time. In Japan, the story is similar yet distinct. During the Nara and Heian periods, a centralized state attempted to build a national network of roads, modeled on the Chinese system, to connect the capital with provinces. These roads, called kondo, were straight and wide, meant to signal imperial order. But Japan's rugged geography, with mountains and rivers cutting across the landscape, made maintenance difficult. By the medieval period, as centralized power weakened and feudal domains rose, many of these official roads fell into disuse. Local paths and mountain passes replaced them, and the once grand roads of the early state faded, sometimes remembered only in place names or in the layout of ancient shrines that once stood along them. In Korea, ancient kingdoms such as Goguryeo, Baekje, and Silla also built networks of roads to facilitate military campaigns and administrative control. These roads were crucial in times of unification, yet when kingdoms fell or capitals moved, stretches of road became irrelevant. Today, only fragments are known, occasionally uncovered during construction work or visible in aerial photographs as faint lines across fields. In many cases, later roads simply overlaid or replaced them, erasing the earlier layers of history. The disappearance of roads in East Asia is not only a matter of geography and neglect, but also of deliberate change. Dynasties often shifted capitals, and when they did, entire networks of roads were redirected. A road leading to an old capital might suddenly lose its significance, and without traffic, it would vanish in a generation. For example, when the Ming Dynasty moved its capital from Nanjing to Beijing, the official road systems adjusted accordingly, and many older routes lost their prominence. In a region so densely settled and cultivated, land was rarely left idle. Old roadbeds became fields, gardens, or new towns. What is striking in East Asia is that despite the disappearance of so many roads, the memory of connectivity remained strong. Literature, poetry, and records often evoke the idea of the journey, the traveler on the road, the messenger bearing news. The physical road may vanish, but the cultural image of the road endured. Today, archaeologists, historians, and even modern technology such as satellite imagery and LiDAR scanning are slowly revealing the ghostly outlines of these lost networks. They remind us that the roads were not just paths of commerce and conquest, but also channels of culture, carrying ideas, religions, and stories. Buddhism spread along these roads from India into China, Korea, and Japan. Confucian officials and wandering poets traveled them, leaving behind verses that survive, even as the paths themselves are gone. The disappearance of ancient roads in East Asia reveals a paradox. The infrastructure of empire may vanish into soil and stone, yet the impact of those roads continues to shape societies centuries later. The fact that a road no longer exists physically does not mean it failed in its purpose. It served its age, carried its travelers, and when its role was complete, it faded away. In that quiet fading lies a lesson about impermanence, about how even the grandest works of empire are temporary, vulnerable to time, politics, and the steady reclaiming hand of nature. In Europe, the story of ancient roads is inseparable from the Romans, who engineered one of the most extensive and enduring networks the world has ever seen. Roman roads stretched from the misty Isles of Britain to the deserts of North Africa, from the Atlantic shores of Hispania to the eastern frontiers near the Euphrates. They were masterpieces of construction, layered with stone, gravel, and compacted earth, built to withstand centuries of use. Their famous straightness symbolized Roman order and efficiency, connecting military camps, provincial towns, and bustling markets. Yet for all their durability, many of these roads eventually disappeared from daily use, eroded not by time alone, but by the collapse of the empire that had sustained them. After the fall of Rome in the 5th century, maintenance of the vast road system faltered. Local kingdoms, fragmented and often embroiled in conflict, lacked the resources and the centralized administration needed to repair and preserve such monumental infrastructure. A Roman road left unrepaired quickly began to crumble. Stones were pried up by villagers to use as building material for walls and houses. Drainage ditches clogged, and vegetation crept over once solid paving. In the forests of Gaul, for instance, stretches of Roman highway turned into little more than uneven tracks, while in the hills of Britain, carefully laid causeways became hidden beneath centuries of soil and moss. The Middle Ages saw the survival of some Roman routes, especially those linking major cities or pilgrimage destinations, but countless secondary roads faded into obscurity. Medieval travelers often avoided the abandoned highways, preferring new paths that wound around hills or followed rivers, even if they were less direct, because old roads had become unsafe. Bandits often lurked along stretches of crumbling highways, and bridges built in Roman times had collapsed. A forgotten road was not only inconvenient, but dangerous. Over the centuries, entire communities shifted, villages grew into towns, and new roads were cut to suit local needs. The great Roman road network, once a marvel of unity, fragmented into a patchwork of tracks whose histories were soon forgotten. In some places, the disappearance was almost deliberate. In Britain, after the Roman withdrawal, Anglo-Saxon settlements grew up in different locations than the old Roman towns, and the new paths that emerged reflected different centers of life. Roman London, for example, was largely abandoned in the early medieval period, and its once bustling roads fell silent, their stones scavenged for other uses. When towns revived centuries later, they grew along slightly altered lines, leaving some of the original Roman roads bypassed and lost. In Italy itself, the heart of the empire, the decline of Roman roads is particularly striking. Despite the continued prestige of Roman engineering, centuries of warfare, invasions, and economic collapse left many routes unusable. In the Apennine Mountains, ancient roads once crossed ridges with carefully cut steps and retaining walls. When those walls failed, entire stretches slid into valleys and vanished under landslides. In the marshy plains near Ravenna, drainage systems failed, and once solid causeways were swallowed by swamps. Even in the eternal city of Rome, roads leading out of the capital fell into disrepair. Grand milestones toppled, and weeds grew where legions once marched. By the High Middle Ages, a new system of roads had begun to emerge, often based on necessity rather than design. Pilgrimage routes like the Camino de Santiago in Spain and the Via Francigena in Italy became the new arteries of travel. Yet these were not the same as the old Roman roads. Some followed ancient paths, but others diverged, seeking safer crossings, monasteries, or hospitable villages. In many regions, the Roman roads remained buried beneath fields, invisible until rediscovered by archaeologists centuries later. Farmers plowing their land would occasionally turn up large paving stones, remnants of a highway that no one in living memory had walked. One reason for the disappearance of Roman roads lies in the changing technology of transport. The heavy carts of Roman armies required sturdy, paved surfaces, but in the Middle Ages, with fewer resources and smaller-scale economies, lighter carts and pack animals became the norm. Dirt tracks, easier to maintain and flexible in routing, were sufficient. Thus, the magnificent engineering of the Romans, while still admired, was not always practical for medieval life. As the centuries passed, legends grew around some of the lost roads. In rural Britain, locals spoke of the Devil's Causeways, or Giant's Roads, mysterious straight lines that cut across fields and hills, but no longer led anywhere obvious. In France, stories were told of old Roman roads buried beneath forests, said to be haunted by the spirits of soldiers who once marched them. Such folklore preserved the memory of the roads even as their physical traces disappeared. Yet not all was lost. In certain areas, Roman roads were absorbed into medieval and modern systems. Portions of the Via Appia in Italy, the Fosse Way in England, and the Via Domitia in southern France continued to serve travelers, albeit altered and narrowed over time. But countless others, especially local spurs and military roads, simply vanished. Today, archaeologists use aerial photography, satellite imaging, and ground-penetrating radar to trace the faint scars of these lost highways. From above, one can sometimes see straight lines of discolored soil cutting across fields, marking the course of a forgotten Roman road. These ghostly outlines remind us that beneath the surface of modern Europe lies a hidden infrastructure that once bound the continent together. The disappearance of ancient roads in Europe is thus a layered story, of grandeur followed by neglect, of resilience followed by reinvention. It shows how infrastructure, no matter how advanced, is always tied to the societies that sustain it. Once the power of Rome crumbled, the roads that depended on that power slowly melted back into the landscape. In this way, the lost roads of Europe serve as a metaphor for history itself, visible in fragments, remembered in stories, and rediscovered when we look beneath the surface. In the Middle East and North Africa, the story of ancient roads is closely bound to the rise and fall of empires and the unforgiving landscapes of desert and mountain that shaped human movement. Long before the Romans expanded eastward, the Persians had already built the Royal Road, a vast network stretching nearly 2,000 miles from Sardis in Anatolia to Susa near the Persian Gulf. Along its length, royal messengers could ride from one end of the empire to the other in just a week, changing horses at carefully placed stations. For centuries, it was a lifeline of communication and commerce, a thread binding together peoples of different languages and faiths. Yet with the conquests of Alexander and later the shifting centers of power, large stretches of this mighty road were abandoned. Without constant upkeep, the gravel surfaces eroded under wind and rain, way stations fell to ruin, and the royal road itself was gradually swallowed by shifting sands and encroaching fields. By the medieval period, much of it had faded, its course remembered only in fragments by local tradition. In North Africa, roads carved by Rome connected fertile coastal cities like Carthage, Leptis Magna, and Alexandria, with the inland provinces and desert frontiers. These routes were not just military supply lines. They carried olive oil, grain, and exotic goods from Africa into Europe, sustaining both economies and armies. Yet when the Western Roman Empire fell, the maintenance of these far-flung roads ceased. Desert winds blew sand across stone paving, and Bedouin herders, preferring flexible tracks suited to camels, let the old paved highways vanish beneath dunes. Some stretches were dismantled by locals seeking cut stone for mosques and houses. Over centuries, once vital arteries of empire became nothing more than faint traces in the desert, visible today only from aerial surveys. In the Arabian Peninsula, roads were less formal but equally vital. The incense trade routes that crossed Yemen and Oman carried frankincense and myrrh north to markets in Petra, Damascus, and beyond. These caravans carved deep paths into the desert, marked by cairns, wells, and occasional stone shelters. For centuries, the wealth of kingdoms like Sheba depended on them. But when maritime trade expanded across the Red Sea and Indian Ocean, camel caravans declined. Wells dried up, way stations were abandoned, and sandstorms erased the very tracks once pressed by thousands of hooves. What had been the arteries of a global luxury trade became ghost trails across empty landscapes. In the Levant, the Via Maris and King's Highway were legendary roads linking Egypt with Mesopotamia, trodden by armies, prophets, and merchants alike. They were the highways of biblical history, carrying both blessings and destruction. But as empires shifted, new cities rose while others fell, and alternative routes developed. The Crusades revived some stretches briefly, but political fragmentation and conflict left many parts dangerous or neglected. Today, archaeologists trace them through faint alignments of stones, ruined milestones, and the occasional preserved Roman bridge, lonely and disconnected in the wilderness. The story of disappearing roads in these regions is not only about time, but about nature's power. In Mesopotamia, where canals and rivers dictated life, roads often followed embankments. When rivers changed course or floods swept away embankments, entire routes disappeared. In North Africa, sand dunes migrated slowly, swallowing ancient highways whole. In mountainous Lebanon and Iran, landslides buried carefully cut tracks, leaving no sign but local legends of hidden roads beneath the soil. Yet fragments persist. In Jordan, parts of the King's Highway still serve modern travelers. In Turkey, stretches of the Persian Royal Road became the foundations of Ottoman post routes. In North Africa, beneath the sands of Libya and Algeria, archaeologists have rediscovered paved Roman roads perfectly preserved under layers of desert dust, as if frozen in time. These discoveries remind us that disappearance is not always destruction. Sometimes it is simply concealment, waiting for rediscovery. Legends grew around these lost paths. In Yemen, old caravan trails were said to be haunted by jinn, warning travelers not to wander them. In Persia, abandoned stretches of the royal road were remembered in folktales of kings who could command the winds to carry their couriers. In the Maghreb, villagers told stories of roads of the ancients buried beneath the dunes, leading to hidden cities of gold. The folklore carried memory where history books were silent. Modern technology allows us to see what was lost. Satellite imagery reveals lines cutting across deserts where no visible road exists, traces of caravans and empires long gone. Archaeologists walking the sands find milestones inscribed in Latin or Greek, toppled and half-buried, silent witnesses to the roads that once commanded these lands. The disappearance of ancient roads in the Middle East and North Africa shows us how fragile infrastructure can be when faced with shifting trade, political collapse, and natural forces. More than Europe, where cooler climates preserved fragments, the deserts and mountains of this region erase roads swiftly, leaving memory to be carried by story rather than stone. But the lessons remain. Even the greatest routes, once lifelines of empires, can fade into dust when no longer sustained by human hands. In Asia, the story of disappearing roads is most famously tied to the Silk Road, a network rather than a single path, stretching thousands of miles from China through Central Asia to the Mediterranean. For centuries, it was not only a highway of goods, but also of ideas, religions, and cultures. Caravans moved silk, porcelain, spices, and precious stones, while missionaries, scholars, and envoys traveled the same routes, spreading Buddhism, Islam, and later Christianity. Cities such as Samarkand, Bukhara, and Kashgar thrived as caravan hubs, their streets filled with the sounds of traders, bargaining in dozens of languages. Yet these great arteries of commerce were never static. The deserts they crossed shifted constantly. Winds buried caravan tracks beneath dunes, mountain passes closed with snow and landslides, and rivers that once marked rest points changed course, leaving stations dry and abandoned. More than natural forces, it was human choice that led to their decline. With the rise of maritime trade in the 15th and 16th centuries, the sea became faster and safer for moving bulk goods. Portuguese, Dutch, and later British ships bypassed overland caravans, sailing directly from Asia to Europe. Slowly, the overland Silk Road emptied. Inns collapsed, caravanserais became ruins, and the steady beat of camel hooves faded into silence. In the Taklamakan Desert of western China, roads once alive with traders are now invisible, hidden beneath endless sand. Archaeologists digging near ancient Lulan have uncovered traces of wheel ruts preserved by dryness, but the city itself was swallowed centuries ago, abandoned when rivers dried. In Central Asia, stone-paved sections of roads still exist, but most of the network has become faint tracks seen only from the air. Villages that once lived from caravan traffic dwindled, some erased entirely, leaving behind little more than pottery shards and eroded foundations. In India, ancient roads tied to empires like the Maurya and Gupta once connected capitals with faraway provinces. The Grand Trunk Road, one of Asia's oldest highways, originally laid down by Mauryan rulers more than 2,000 years ago, stretched for thousands of miles. For centuries, it remained the backbone of trade and administration, used by conquerors from the Mughals to the British. Today, modern asphalt overlays much of its course, but countless side routes that once branched into rural markets and temple towns have vanished. Farmers plowed them into fields, cities expanded over them, and where the jungle grew back, paths were reclaimed by roots and vines. In Southeast Asia, Khmer roads once linked Angkor to its provinces. Massive laterite causeways and bridges carried armies and goods across Cambodia and Thailand. Some were so well built that parts still serve as village paths. Yet when Angkor fell and jungle spread, whole segments disappeared beneath trees and soil. Travelers in the 19th century wrote of stumbling upon giant stone bridges deep in the forest, isolated from any visible road, like relics of a forgotten age. In China, beyond the Silk Road, the empire maintained enormous postal highways connecting the capital to provinces. These were marked by stone steles and dotted with courier stations. But dynasties rose and fell, and with them, priorities shifted. Some stretches were deliberately abandoned when routes were rerouted for security or political reasons. Earth and vegetation reclaimed the old tracks, and only isolated milestones remain, carved with imperial edicts, standing alone in fields. Legends filled the void where memory failed. In Central Asia, old caravan routes were said to be haunted by spirits of lost travelers, their footprints guiding caravans astray. In India, certain ruined causeways were called ghost roads, believed to lead nowhere, cursed by kings who once walked them. In the forests of Cambodia, villagers told stories of roads that appeared only under moonlight, leading to temples hidden from ordinary eyes. These tales preserved the sense of mystery long after the roads themselves had vanished. Modern exploration has revealed fragments of these lost routes. Satellite imagery shows faint lines cutting across deserts, parallel to surviving paths, suggesting caravans shifted routes when old ones failed. Archaeologists walking mountains in Kyrgyzstan or Iran sometimes discover ancient paving stones, remnants of roads unseen for centuries. In Cambodia, LiDAR scans of jungle canopy have exposed entire networks of roads and canals connecting Angkor's temples, invisible until technology stripped away the trees. The disappearance of Asia's roads tells us something profound about impermanence. No matter how grand the empire or how vital the trade, roads endure only as long as they are needed. When sailors found faster sea passages, when rivers dried, when capitals shifted, the roads were left to fade. Unlike monuments of stone, roads depend on constant use to remain alive. Without travelers to press down the earth, without officials to repair stones, without caravans to keep the memory alive, they are claimed by sand, forest, and time. And yet, even in disappearance, they remain part of history's fabric. Every ruined caravanserai, every half-buried milestone, every forgotten bridge whispers of the millions of footsteps that once passed. To walk along these faint traces today is to sense a shadow of the great networks that bound Asia together, roads that disappeared, but whose echoes still shape our world. In Europe, the story of disappearing roads is a layered tale that spans the fall of Rome, the rise of medieval kingdoms, and the slow reshaping of the continent through centuries of war, migration, and commerce. The Roman Empire had constructed one of the most extensive road systems the world had ever seen. Tens of thousands of miles of stone-paved highways that linked Britain to the Mediterranean, Gaul to Germania, and Spain to the eastern provinces. Their straight lines, cambered surfaces, and milestones represented order and permanence, a symbol of imperial power. Yet when the empire fragmented, many of these roads were left without maintenance. Stone surfaces cracked, weeds sprouted, and bridges collapsed. Some remained in use for centuries, but many others vanished beneath layers of soil, their courses forgotten by the very people who once marched along them. In medieval times, travelers often preferred tracks that wound around hills or avoided dangerous marshes rather than the direct Roman roads that cut through hostile territory. Over time, whole sections of Roman highways disappeared, plowed into farmland, or built over by growing villages. The Via Appia in Italy still stands as a monument to engineering, but countless smaller routes became hidden. Archaeologists working in France and Britain frequently discover Roman paving beneath modern fields, preserved only because they were abandoned early. In Britain, the famous Watling Street was still used in part, but its side branches faded from maps, buried under hedgerows and farmland. In Gaul, the road from Bordeaux to Lyon once carried legions and merchants, yet large parts are now only faint embankments seen from aerial surveys. The Middle Ages also produced their own networks, pilgrim roads to Santiago de Compostela, Canterbury, or Rome, as well as trade routes connecting Hanseatic towns or linking Italy with the Alps. But these too were fragile. Wars often destroyed bridges and way stations. When borders shifted, old roads leading to former capitals lost their significance. For example, in Germany, the shifting centers of power caused whole stretches of medieval highways to become redundant. Forests reclaimed them, leaving faint hollows in the ground known as holloways. These holloways can still be seen in parts of England and France, sunken lanes worn deep by centuries of feet, hooves, and wheels. Some are now so overgrown that they resemble trenches hidden under trees, their origins obscure even to locals. In Scandinavia, Viking-age paths across forests and marshes were marked by wooden planks laid over bogs. Many of these trackways were abandoned when settlements shifted or new harbors rose to prominence. Today, only fragments remain in peat bogs, preserved by waterlogged soil, their lines leading nowhere in the modern landscape. In Italy, roads to once thriving towns that fell to malaria or invasion faded as populations retreated. Whole medieval villages disappeared, taking their roads with them. Stone bridges stand isolated in valleys, no longer connected to any path, looking like ruins of forgotten journeys. In Spain, Moorish-era routes once connected Al-Andalus with North Africa and the interior of Iberia. After the Reconquista, trade shifted northward, and some of these southern arteries withered. Farmers dismantled roadstones for building, and scrub reclaimed the rest. Even the Great Camino de Santiago, though still famous, had stretches lost for centuries until rediscovered by modern pilgrims. The Renaissance brought new cartography, and with it, the rediscovery of some old routes, but others were erased intentionally. Rulers redirected commerce through favored cities, bypassing rivals. For example, canals in the Low Countries replaced certain roads, leaving their former paths redundant. In England, the Enclosure Acts of the 17th and 18th centuries fenced off common land, cutting across traditional byways. Many of these ancient tracts were absorbed into private estates, erased from maps. Villagers remembered them only in folklore, as lost lanes said to reappear on moonlit nights. In folklore, forgotten roads often became symbols of mystery. English legends told of phantom carriages traveling along invisible roads, their sounds heard at night, though no path was visible. In France, abandoned causeways were said to be haunted by spirits of medieval travelers. These tales carried memory of the roads long after they vanished from physical sight. The Industrial Revolution accelerated the disappearance of older paths. Railways cut across the landscape, and as new stations rose, old towns without rail access dwindled, their medieval roads falling silent. Cobblestones were dug up, replaced by asphalt. The ancient trackways remained only as field boundaries, hedgerows, or faint depressions in the earth. Today, archaeologists and local historians piece together the story of these lost European roads through maps, aerial photography, and fieldwork. In France, the Cassini maps of the 18th century reveal routes no longer visible. In England, LiDAR scans expose sunken lanes hidden under woods. In Italy and Spain, old milestones and bridges give away the presence of long-vanished routes. What unites all these stories is the realization that roads, no matter how grand, are temporary when their societies change. The Roman Empire believed its roads eternal, yet half are gone. Medieval pilgrims trusted paths to last forever, yet many were cut by fields or lost in forests. What survives is not the road itself, but the memory carried in folklore, ruins, and faint traces in the land. Europe's landscape is crisscrossed by ghosts of roads, some now invisible, others only whispered about in villages. They are the silent evidence of how civilizations move, rise, and fade. To walk across a meadow in England or a vineyard in France is sometimes to unknowingly step upon a road that once shaped history, a road now disappeared, but never truly gone. In Africa and the Americas, the story of vanished roads takes on a different shape, yet it speaks to the same truth that human pathways are fragile, tied to the societies that built them, and easily erased by time and nature. In North Africa, the Roman Empire once laid down a network of roads stretching across modern-day Morocco, Algeria, Tunisia, and Libya, connecting coastal cities to the Sahara frontier. These were the arteries of trade, carrying grain, olive oil, and soldiers. But when Roman power receded, many fell into neglect. Shifting sands buried sections of road, stones were taken for building new villages. Caravan routes that followed the stars and oases replaced the engineered lines of Rome. Today, archaeologists in Tunisia still uncover Roman milestones in desert scrub, silent reminders of roads that once pulsed with life. Further south, Africa had its own great pathways, shaped not by stone, but by human footsteps, camels, and donkeys across deserts and savannas. The trans-Saharan trade routes, centuries old, connected Timbuktu, Gao, and Kano to the Mediterranean world. These roads were not paved, but they were mapped by memory and caravan tradition. Salt, gold, ivory, and manuscripts moved along them. Yet with the rise of Atlantic trade and European colonial ports, these inland routes dwindled. Sand swallowed way stations, wells dried, and the roads became mere traces in oral tradition. Today, one can stand in parts of Mali or Niger and see nothing but desert, unaware that caravans once passed daily across the horizon. In sub-Saharan Africa, local footpaths crisscross dense forests and savannas, serving kingdoms like Great Zimbabwe or Benin. These paths rarely left stone traces, but they directed armies, hunters, and traders for centuries. When empires collapsed or colonial boundaries redirected commerce to the coast, many inland paths disappeared. Forests grew back, erasing memory, and only anthropologists retracing oral histories can identify where the great roads of African kingdoms once lay. In the Americas, the Inca Empire built perhaps the most remarkable road network outside of Rome, stretching more than 20,000 miles across mountains, valleys, and deserts. The Capac Ñan, as it is known, linked Cusco to Quito, to Chile, and to Argentina. With stone-paved highways, suspension bridges of woven grass, and relay stations, it was a marvel of pre-Columbian engineering. Messengers known as chasqui carried messages and goods at extraordinary speed. Yet after the Spanish conquest, much of this road system was abandoned. New cities grew along colonial lines of trade, favoring ports like Lima. The old Inca routes were left to weeds and landslides. Many segments vanished into the Andes, only rediscovered by archaeologists centuries later. Even today, locals walk on parts of the Inca Trail, but vast stretches lie hidden beneath jungle or collapsed into ravines, roads without travelers, roads without memory in the official maps. North America, too, had its ancient paths. Indigenous peoples had trade routes long before Europeans arrived, connecting the Great Lakes to the Mississippi, or the pueblos of the Southwest to the Pacific coast. These trails carried obsidian, shells, copper, and stories. But when European settlers imposed new grids of roads and railways, the old indigenous pathways disappeared from sight. Some survive only as place names or as faint traces visible from the air, known to archaeologists but forgotten by the public. In Mesoamerica, the Maya built Sacbeob, raised white stone causeways connecting cities across the Yucatan. These glowing paths, made of limestone and plaster, stood out in the jungle by moonlight, guiding pilgrims and traders. After the collapse of Maya city-states, many Sacbeob were swallowed by forest. A few remain visible near sites like Koba, but most are buried, their lines seen only through modern LiDAR scanning that cuts through vegetation. They are ghost roads, visible from satellites but not from human eyes on the ground. In the Caribbean, the Taino and other peoples traveled by canoe and foot along routes that tied islands together in a web of exchange. When their societies collapsed under disease and conquest, the pathways they used vanished, erased not only physically but culturally. Colonial roads replaced them, leaving no trace. Across these continents, climate and colonization played the greatest role in erasing ancient paths. Roads of stone might endure, but those made of earth and memory were fragile. Floods in the Amazon washed away paths, earthquakes in the Andes cut through highways, and deserts reclaimed caravan trails. Colonial powers often actively destroyed native routes, building their own systems to serve ports and plantations. In doing so, they severed ancient networks, ensuring that roads which once tied entire civilizations together were left to disappear. Yet, just as in Europe and Asia, faint traces linger. Archaeologists use LiDAR, aerial photography, and local memory to rediscover forgotten roads. Farmers plowing a field in Peru may uncover an Inca paving stone. A shepherd in Niger may know of a hollow where caravans once camped. An old story in the American Midwest may reference a trail that no longer exists, leading nowhere now, but once leading everywhere. The story of disappearing roads in Africa and the Americas shows that roads are not eternal. They are living things tied to human use, and when that use ends, they die, leaving only shadows. What survives are fragments, legends, and faint scars upon the earth. They remind us that every road we walk today may one day vanish too, as time, nature, and society move onward, covering the lines we once thought permanent. Thank you so much for choosing to spend your time with Sleep Whisper. May your morning, when you wake, be filled with good luck, gentle energy, and success in all the work you set out to do. I look forward to seeing you again tomorrow night, right here at Sleep Whisper.